The gaslight hissed, a serpent trapped in glass. Thomas Wakley sat with the letter open on his desk, the paper damp enough to warp under the weight of his own stillness. Smoke from the street below had seeped through the sash window of the Strand office, coating the damp plaster in a film of oily soot that tasted of coal dust and forgotten fires. He did not reach for the decanter. His fingers, stained permanently with printer's ink, traced the rough edge of the envelope where it had been torn open, not by a letter opener, but by a thumbnail driven hard against the seal in desperation. Inside, the handwriting stumbled. Sarah Goff wrote of the churchyard at St. Matthew Bethnal Green as a woman might describe the violation of her own bedchamber. She spoke of the earth, not the theft of the wood, for the coffin remained, a hollow shell left behind like the husk of a beetle, but the lightness of the soil when she pressed her palm against the fresh mound that morning. The grave had settled too quickly. The clay gave way without resistance, offering up nothing but a void where her child should have rested in the quiet dark. Wakley read the line again. It smelled of copper, sir, and salt, not of the churchyard damp. He stopped breathing for a count of 3. Copper and salt. The scent of fresh blood mixed with the brine of tears, or perhaps the sweat of men who had labored hard in the cold hours before dawn. It was not the smell of decay, which takes days to bloom, but the metallic tang of a wound still weeping. A medical man knew the difference between the odor of a grave settling and the odor of a body lifted while the fluids were yet warm. This was no common resurrectionist digging for a stiff to sell to the schools for 3 guineas. This was a harvest taken before the flesh had even thought to cool. The quill slipped from his grip. Ink pooled on the mahogany, a black lake spreading slowly towards the edge of the desk, threatening to drip onto the floorboards. Wakley watched the spill, mesmerized by the way the liquid sought the lowest point, just as the dead were sought by those who saw them not as souls but as stock. He did not blot it, let it stain. Let the wood remember the spill, just as the earth remembered the hollow. Outside, a cart wheel clattered over the cobbles, the iron rim striking a stone with a spark that vanished instantly in the gloom. London moved on, indifferent to the mathematics of the grave. Under the common law, a corpse held no property value. One could not steal what belonged to no one. If Bishop and his gang had taken only the body, leaving the shroud and the coffin wood behind, they had committed a misdemeanor at worst, a petty trespass punishable by a few months in Newgate if caught, rather than the hangman's noose. The law offered them a shield woven from technicality, a juridical abyss where morality drowned in semantics. Wakley leaned back, the chair groaning under his shift in weight. He looked at the letter again, at the smudge of grey mud transferred from Sarah Goff's hand to the page. It was a specific clay, heavy and fine, distinct from the gritty loam of the northern parishes. He knew this soil. He had walked the paths of St. Giles and Bethnal Green often enough to recognize the geology of grief. The resurrection men did not roam at random. They hunted where the ground was soft and the watchmen were few, targeting the fresh grave of the poor who could not afford iron coffins or heavy locks. But the smell, copper, that changed the calculus. It shifted the crime from the theft of a commodity to the creation of one. If the body was warm enough to retain the scent of fresh blood, then the grave had not been the end of the life, but merely a pause before the final slaughter. Murder carried the rope. Theft carried only a fine. Wakley felt a cold tightening in his gut, a sensation not of fear, but of recognition. He was looking at the signature of a killer who used the grave as a larder. He picked up the letter, holding it close to the gaslight. The flame flickered, casting long, dancing shadows that made the words seem to crawl across the page. Sarah Goff's grief was raw, unpolished, stripped of the polite euphemisms favored by the upper classes. She did not speak of departure or rest. She spoke of emptiness. She spoke of the dirt that felt wrong under her hand. Her voice echoed the broadsheets Wakley had read in the morning, the terrified whispers of mothers in the rookeries who checked their children's breathing every hour, terrified that the sleep might become permanent before the sun rose. The Anatomy Act hung over them all like a storm cloud yet to break. Parliament debated the legalization of dissection for the unclaimed poor, a move that would sanitize the trade Wakley sought to expose. If the act passed before he could bring the truth to light, The outrage would dissipate, swallowed by the machinery of the state. The gang led by John Bishop would become not criminals, but suppliers, their actions legitimized by the very statute meant to regulate them. Wakley could not let that happen. He set the letter down beside the ink spill, the two stains mirroring each other, a one grey earth, one black ink. Both were evidence, both were testimony. He reached for a fresh sheet of paper, pulling it from the stack with a sharp crackle that sounded too loud in the silent room. The quill hovered above the surface, the nib trembling slightly before he forced his hand to stillness. He would not write a condolence. Sarah Goff did not need words of comfort. She needed justice, and justice required a name attached to the hollow grave. He began to draft a response, not to the widow, but to himself, outlining the questions that needed answers. Where was the body now? Which surgeon had paid the gold? Who had seen the cart in the fog? The gaslight sputtered. A draft from the window pane chilled the back of his neck, raising the hairs on his skin. Wakley ignored it. He dipped the pen again, the ink welling up around the steel nib, dark and viscous. He wrote the date, October 1831. The ink flowed, forming letters that looked like bones laid out in rows. He wrote of the copper smell. He wrote of the lightness of the earth. He wrote of the law that failed the dead. The scratch of the nib was the only sound in the room, a rhythmic scraping against the fiber of the paper. It sounded like a shovel biting into clay. He paused, lifting the pen as a thought struck him with the force of a physical blow. If the gang was moving bodies this quickly, selling them while the scent of blood still clung to the skin, they were not waiting for natural death. They were hastening it. The financial pressure was known. A fresh subject commanded 8 guineas, while a stiff fetched 3. The difference was enough to tempt a man to murder, especially when the law offered no penalty for the theft of the corpse itself. Wakley underlined the word murder. The ink soaked deep, bleeding through to the other side of the page. He folded the letter from Sarah Goff and placed it in his coat pocket, directly over his heart. The paper felt heavy, weighted by the grief of a mother and the silence of a child who would never be entered into the parish register as anything more than a nameless pauper. He stood up, the movement abrupt, knocking the chair back against the floorboards. The noise echoed in the small office, a sharp rebuke to the stillness. It was time to leave the safety of the editorial desk. The ink on his hands was dry, but the stain of the city was wet and waiting outside. He grabbed his hat, pulling it low over his eyes, and extinguished the gaslight with a twist of the valve. Darkness rushed in, thick and immediate, smelling of smoke and the faint, lingering trace of the copper scent that seemed to have followed him from the page. Wakley opened the door to the corridor. The stairs awaited, leading down to the street where the fog rolled off the Thames, ready to swallow anyone foolish enough to walk without a lantern. He stepped out, closing the door softly behind him, leaving the letters echo in the room. The hunt began not with a shout, but with the quiet closing of a door and the knowledge that somewhere in the dark, a cart was moving with a weight far heavier than coal. He took the first step down, his boot heels striking the wood with a solid, final thud. The fog did not roll, it pressed. It shoved itself against the brickwork of the Strand, a wet yellow wool that muffled the clatter of hooves and turned the gas lamps into drowning stars. Wakley stepped onto the pavement, the dampness instantly seizing the wool of his trousers, clinging with the tenacity of a leech. He pulled his coat collar high, shielding his neck from the river's breath, which tasted of salt, coal smoke, and the underlying sweetness of things left too long in the sun. Down into the throat of the city. The streets here were not paved with stone, but packed with a slurry of horse dung, rotting vegetable matter, and the grey clay that gave the district its name. His boots found purchase only by luck, sliding slightly on the slick surface before he corrected his balance. A cart rumbled past, the wheels groaning under a load unseen within the mist, the driver invisible save for the glowing tip of a clay pipe that flared and dimmed like a dying ember. Wakley kept to the wall, his shoulder brushing the rough, soot-blackened bricks, moving with a purpose that felt increasingly foolish as the visibility shrank to the length of his own arm. He needed the river. The water was the artery, and the resurrection men were the parasites that fed upon it, using the tributaries of fog and tide to transport their goods from the churchyards to the dissecting tables. A sound broke the muffled silence, not a footstep, but the drag of something heavy, a wet sucking friction against the mud. Wakley stopped, pressing his back flat against the cold brick of a chandler's shop, his hand drifting instinctively to the pocket where Sarah Goff's letter rested against his ribs. The paper crinkled, a sharp, dry noise that seemed deafening in the stillness. He froze, holding his breath until his lungs burned, waiting for the sound to repeat. There again. Two figures emerged from the gloom ahead, materializing like spirits conjured by the damp. They walked with a strange, loping gait, their shoulders hunched inward, as if protecting a precious cargo from the rain that was not yet falling but hung suspended in the air. Between them, swung on a pole resting on their shoulders, was a sack. It was long, roughly the length of a man, and it moved with a fluid, sickening inertia that no sack of coal or turnips could ever mimic. Coal did not sway with the limp resistance of joints. Turnips did not drag a toe through the mud when the carriers stumbled. Wakley watched them, his heart hammering a steady, violent rhythm against the folded letter. 8 guineas for fresh, 3 for stiff, the arithmetic of the grave. These men were not stealing wood, they were harvesting currency. The sack bumped against the leg of the rear carrier, and a dark stain bloomed on the Hessian, spreading slowly in the dim light. Blood, or merely the seepage of the earth, it did not matter. The weight was the truth. He stepped forward, his boot landing in a patch of mud that felt different from the rest. Greasier, finer, he halted, looking down. The sediment here was not the brown sludge of the street runoff, but a distinct pale gray, almost blue in the faint lamplight. He knelt, ignoring the cold water that immediately soaked through his trousers to bite at his knee, and rubbed the substance between his thumb and forefinger. It gritted, fine and powdery, smelling faintly of iron and old water. Bethnal green clay. It matched the sample Sarah Goff had described. The earth she claimed smelled of copper. This patch of mud was a smudge, left by boots that had walked the same soil as the violated grave of her child. The connection snapped into place with the clarity of a surgical incision. These men, or others like them wearing the same soil, had walked from the churchyard of St. Matthew to this very corner, carrying their burden through the fog while the parish slept. The figures ahead paused. The rear man shifted his grip, groaning under the weight, and for a second the sack slipped, revealing the shape of a foot inside the coarse fabric. A bare foot, pale as wax, dangling lifelessly before being hauled back up. Wakley's stomach turned, a physical recoil that he suppressed by clenching his jaw until the muscles ached. He wanted to shout, to demand they stop, to invoke the name of the law that offered so little protection. But the law was a piece of paper, and these men were armed with the darkness and the knowledge that what they carried had no owner. To intervene now was to lose everything. If he startled them, they would drop the burden and vanish into the labyrinth of alleys that honeycombed the rookeries, leaving him with nothing but a sack of dead flesh and no proof of who had killed it. The body itself was evidence of nothing but death. The crime lay in the intent, in the transition from grave to market. He needed to see where they took it. He needed the surgeon's name, the gold changing hands, the moment the commodity became currency. The figures turned sharply into a narrow alleyway to the left, a slit in the masonry so dark it seemed to swallow the light whole. They moved with the practiced ease of men who knew every uneven stone and every protruding nail in the dark. Wakley waited a count of 10, listening to their footsteps recede into a rhythmic squelch before he moved. He pulled his leather-bound notebook from his pocket, the pages stiff with dampness, and flipped to a fresh sheet. With a pencil that felt clumsy in his chilled fingers, he drew a precise cross on the page, marking the corner where the grey mud lay thickest. Corner of Crane Court, grey clay, iron scent. He wrote quickly, the letters jagged and hurried, before shoving the book back into his coat. The alley mouth gaped before him, a tunnel of absolute blackness. The smell emanating from it was stronger now, a cloying mixture of gin, rot, and that metallic tang of fresh blood that no amount of fog could mask. It was the smell of the anatomy theater brought out into the street. Wakley stepped into the shadow, his eyes straining to adjust to the void. The mud here was deeper, sucking at his boots with a greedy hunger. He moved silently, placing his feet with care, mimicking the loping gait he had observed. The darkness pressed against his eyes, thick and suffocating, but he pushed on, driven by the image of the bare foot dangling in the mist. Somewhere ahead in the belly of this fog, a transaction was taking place. Gold for flesh, silence for justice. He rounded a bend in the alley, the wall rough against his fingertips, and saw a faint glow ahead. A lantern, shielded by a hand casting long, dancing shadows against the brick. Voices murmured, low and indistinct, carrying the cadence of a bargain being struck. Wakley stopped, flattening himself against the wet wall, his breath coming in shallow puffs of white steam. He was close enough to hear the clink of coin, the distinct, heavy chime of sovereigns hitting a palm. Then a voice cut through the murmur, clear and sharp despite the distance. Warm yet. The question hung in the air, terrible in its casual brutality. It was not a question about the weather. It was an inquiry into the freshness of the stock. Wakley's hand tightened around the pencil in his pocket, the wood digging into his palm. He did not move. He did not breathe. He simply listened, committing the timbre of the voice to memory, knowing that this sound, this single phrase, was the thread he would pull to unravel the whole bloody tapestry. The lantern flared brighter as the deal concluded, and the shadows lengthened, stretching towards him like grasping fingers. Wakley stepped back, melting into the deeper dark of the recess, waiting for the light to pass. The hunt had moved from the page to the pavement, and the clay under his nails was no longer just dirt. It was testimony. The lantern light receded, swallowed by the turn of the passage, leaving Wakley alone in a darkness that felt solid against his skin. He did not follow. To pursue them now, into the final throat of the alley where the buyers waited with their coin and their knives, was to risk exposure that would sever the thread before it could be traced to the source. He stood motionless, listening to the retreating squelch of boots and the low murmur of voices that had just priced a human life like a side of beef. The silence they left behind was not empty. It hung heavy, pressurized by the transaction that had just occurred in the wet dark. He turned on his heel, the mud releasing his boot with a wet slap, and began the walk towards Lincoln's Inn Fields. King's College stood imposing against the night sky, its windows glowing with a sickly yellow warmth that promised shelter but offered no comfort. Wakley knew the surgeon on duty, a man named Ross whose hands were steady but whose conscience had long ago been cauterized by the demands of his profession. There was no need for subterfuge at the door. Wakley's name still carried weight in the medical circles, a passport that opened gates even when the business inside was best kept shadowed. He rapped the knocker, the sound sharp and authoritative, and waited until the latch clicked, and the door swung inward to reveal a porter whose eyes held the dull resignation of a man who sees too much and says nothing. "The theater," Wakley said, stripping off his gloves. "I require a moment with the new intake." The porter hesitated, a flicker of uncertainty crossing his face before deference took hold. "Mr. Ross is with the subject, sir. He was not expecting her." "He will see me," Wakley cut in, stepping past the man before the objection could fully form. He added that it concerns the quality of the supply from the parishes, for he will not wish to delay. He moved through the corridors, the air growing thicker as he approached the dissection rooms. The smell hit him first, a wall of scent that bypassed the nose and settled directly in the stomach. It was not merely the odor of decay, which he knew well from the wards and the graveyards, but something sharper, chemical and sweet, the scent of spirits used to preserve what nature wished to reclaim. Beneath it lay the cloying sweetness of rotting flesh, a perfume that no amount of lavender water or burning tar could ever truly mask. It was the smell of the alleyway, concentrated and distilled within these brick walls. Wakley pushed open the door to the theater. The room was cold, the temperature kept low to slow the progress of putrefaction. Gas jets hissed overhead, casting a harsh, unforgiving light onto the slate table in the center of the room. Upon it lay the subject. It was a male, or had been stripped of all clothing and dignity, the skin pale and waxy under the glare. Ross stood beside the table, a scalpel in hand, pausing as Wakley entered. The surgeon's face was flushed, a sheen of sweat on his forehead despite the chill, and his eyes darted quickly to the door before fixing on Wakley with a forced calm. "Wakley," Ross said, his voice tight, "you have the habit of appearing when least convenient. We are in the midst of an examination." "I see that," Wakley replied, stepping closer to the table without looking at Ross's face, his gaze fixed instead on the body. "And I see the condition of the stock, fresh. Workhouse intake, died of fever 2 days past," Ross said, the words tumbling out too quickly, a rehearsed lie that sat awkwardly on his tongue. The parish officer signed the release himself. All in order, I assure you. Wakley leaned over the table, ignoring the surgeon's defensive posture. He reached out, his fingers hovering inches above the neck of the deceased. There, distinct against the pallor of the skin, was a bruising pattern that told a story no parish register could record. It was not the mottling of disease, nor the discoloration of natural death. It was a ring of purple and black, circumferential and deep, the unmistakable signature of fingers that had squeezed the life out of a throat with deliberate, crushing force. The skin around the mark was unbroken, but the tissue beneath was ruptured, an internal scream frozen in flesh. Fever, Wakley murmured, the word tasting like ash. Does fever leave the mark of a thumb on the hide bone, Mr. Ross? Ross shifted his weight, the scalpel twitching in his grip as he spoke. You are seeing things that are not there, Wakley. The body was compromised upon arrival. It happens. The resurrectionists are not gentle, he reminded him, and you know this. The resurrectionists dig up the dead, Wakley said, his voice dropping to a low register that carried more threat than a shout. They do not strangle the living to improve their merchandise. There is a distinction, though the law seems determined to ignore it. He looked up, meeting Ross's eyes. The surgeon looked away, focusing intently on a tray of instruments, as if the arrangement of steel held the answer to his moral discomfort. The silence stretched between them, filled only by the hiss of the gas and the distant drip of water somewhere in the pipes. Wakley saw the guilt there, plain and undeniably human. Ross knew he had to know. No surgeon of his experience could mistake strangulation for fever, yet here he stood, complicit in the commerce, protecting the supply chain that fed his students and his reputation. The law protects you, Wakley said softly. As long as the body is dead before it reaches your table, you are safe. It matters not how the death occurred, provided the paperwork says otherwise. A convenient fiction, is it not, that the origin of the commodity is irrelevant to the consumer? I teach anatomy, Wakley, not jurisprudence, Ross snapped, his defensiveness flaring into anger. If you have a grievance with the parishes, take it to the vestry. Do not bring your crusade into my theatre and accuse me of crimes based on discoloration. It is not discoloration, Wakley said. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his notebook, flipping it open to a blank page. He did not write. He simply held the book, a shield against the horror of the room. It is evidence. And one day, Mr. Ross, the law will catch up to the knife. When it does, I trust you will have more than a parish signature to offer the judge. He stepped back from the table, the image of the bruised neck burning itself into his mind. It matched the bare foot in the sack. It matched the question in the alley, warm yet. The chain was complete, from the grave in Bethnal Green to the fog of Crane Court, and finally to this slate table where the dead were stripped of their names and their histories. The system was not broken. It was functioning exactly as designed, grinding the poor into lessons for the rich. I will be watching, Wakley said, turning towards the door. Not just the men in the alleys, Ross, but the hands that receive what they carry. Get out, Ross whispered, the anger draining away to leave only a weary resignation. Finish your work and leave me to mine. Wakley did not reply. He walked out of the theatre, the heavy door clicking shut behind him, sealing the smell and the shame inside. The corridor seemed colder now, the shadows deeper. He descended the stairs and stepped out into the night, the fresh air doing little to cleanse the taste of bile from his throat. The fog had lifted slightly, revealing the jagged outline of the city against a starless sky. He began the walk back to the Strand, his mind racing ahead of his feet. The bruise on the neck was the key. It proved intent. It proved murder. But under the current statute, it proved nothing if the body could not be linked to a specific missing person, if the grave could not be proven violated of its shroud rather than its contents. The law was a sieve, and justice was slipping through the holes. He needed a way to plug them. He needed to force the parishes to speak, to make the silent registers scream the names of the stolen dead. By the time he reached his office, the idea had taken root, hard and cold as a stone in his gut. He lit a fresh candle, the flame steadying as he sat at his desk. He pulled a sheet of paper towards him, dipping his pen into the inkwell with a deliberate slowness. The scratch of the nib against the paper was loud in the quiet room, a rhythmic sound that matched the beating of his own heart. He would not write an article, not yet. He would write a letter. A circular to every parish vestry in London, demanding not accounts of money, but accounts of the dead. He would ask for the names of those buried without iron coffins, those too poor to protect their own from the spade. He wrote the first line, the ink flowing dark and permanent. To the churchwardens and overseers of the poor. The words formed a weapon, crude but sharp. If he could not catch the resurrection men stealing the bodies, he would catch them by counting the empty grave. He would make the absence visible. He would force the city to see the holes in the earth and ask what filled them. The pen moved faster now, driven by the memory of the bruise and the casual brutality of the voice in the alley. The hunt was no longer just in the streets. It was here, in the ink, in the record, in the slow, grinding work of exposing the rot that festered beneath the cobblestones. Wakley blew on the wet ink, watching it dry to a dull black. Outside, the city slept, unaware that the ledger was about to be opened. The clay sucked at her knees, cold and greedy, a living thing that wanted to pull her down into the dark with him. Sarah Goff did not feel the chill seeping through the wool of her skirt, nor the way the dampness of St. Giles churchyard clung to her skin like a second, heavier shroud. She felt only the absence where her son should be. The lantern beside her sputtered, its flame struggling against the draught that whipped through the yew trees, casting jagged, dancing shapes across the headstones that looked too much like men standing watch. She had come back. Of course she had come back. A mother does not sleep while her child lies open to the air. Her fingers, raw from the wind and the earlier digging, scrabbled at the loose earth again. Nothing. Just mud. The grave, which she had covered with such tender care only 3 nights prior, was a gaping wound now, the soil turned over with a haste that spoke of fear or greed, perhaps both. She dug until a fingernail caught on a stone and snapped, the pain sharp and bright, but she did not stop. She could not stop. The hole deepened, widening into a pit that seemed to mock her smallness, her poverty, her utter inability to keep anything safe in this God-forsaken city. Thomas, she whispered. The name fell from her lips and vanished instantly, swallowed by the thick fog rolling in from the river. It was a foolish thing to say aloud. The dead do not answer, not here, not where the ground is so cheap and the souls so easily discarded. She reached deeper, her hand brushing against something rough and wet. Linen. A fragment of the shroud she had stitched herself, the coarse fabric torn as if by a dog's teeth. Her stomach heaved, a violent spasm that bent her double over the open grave, but there was nothing left to bring up, only bile and the taste of ash. She pulled the scrap of cloth from the mud, holding it up to the lantern's dying light. It was stained with the distinct, dark imprint of a boot heel, the tread pattern sharp and cruel in the weave, not the soft shuffle of a sexton checking a lock, nor the careful tread of a mourner. This was the mark of a man who needed leverage, a man who dug for profit. A dog barked in the distance, a lonely, sharp sound that echoed off the brickwork of the church nave. Then came the clock. The parish clock began its rhythmic chiming, the bronze tongue striking the hour with a dull, heavy thud that seemed to vibrate in Sarah's chest. 1, 2, 3. Each chime marked another hour stolen from her, another hour her boy spent God knew where, under God knew what knife. The sound was relentless, a mechanical heartbeat counting down the time until the flesh would be too far gone to recognize, until the face she loved would be reduced to a diagram in a surgeon's notebook. She dropped the linen fragment back into the dirt. It felt like burying him all over again. The law said nothing had been stolen. She knew this. The constable had told her as much when she first ran to him, his face a mask of bored pity while he sharpened his quill. No property in a corpse, Mrs. Goff, he had said, the words sliding off him like rain off a slate roof, unless they took the shroud or the coffin wood. Just the body, that's a misdemeanor at best. A nuisance, as if her child were a lost cat or a misplaced bundle of laundry. The injustice of it sat in her throat, hard and unswallowable, choking off any prayer she might have tried to form. They could take him, sell him, cut him open, and the law would shrug, provided they left the wood behind. But they had taken the shroud too. They had torn it. Sarah wiped her muddy hands on her apron, leaving streaks of grey clay against the black fabric of her morning dress. Her breath plumed before her, white and ghostly, vanishing as quickly as her words had. She looked down into the hole, into the dark earth that had already given up its secret. It was empty now, save for the mud and the rain beginning to fall in fine, needle-like drops that strung her cheeks. "You will not be a lesson," she said, her voice trembling low and fierce. "I swear it." It was a promise made to the dirt, to the silence, to a system that viewed the poor as raw material for the education of the rich. She did not know how she would keep it. She had no money for bribes, no influence with the vestry, no voice that carried further than the end of her own alley. But the rage burning in her belly was hotter than the cold clay, sharper than the broken nail. It was a new sensation, this anger, displacing the heavy, suffocating grief that had held her in its grip since the fever took him. Grief made you small, anger made you large. Grief made you kneel, anger made you stand. She stood up, her joints cracking in the damp air, and looked out towards the wall of the churchyard. Beyond lay the streets of Bethnal Green, a labyrinth of shadows and fog where men moved with purpose while women like her waited in the dark. Somewhere out there, someone had paid for Thomas. Someone had counted out gold sovereigns for the warmth of his skin, for the freshness of his limbs. The thought made her hands clench into fists, the mud caking under her nails hardening like armor. The lantern gave a final, pathetic wheeze and died, plunging her into near-total darkness. The church clock struck the half-hour, a single mournful note that hung in the air long after the vibration had ceased. Sarah did not relight the wick. She did not need the light to find her way to the public houses near the docks, nor to find the men who drank there with full pockets and empty consciences. She knew the smell of them, even if she could not see their faces. She knew the sound of their boots on the pavement. She turned away from the grave, stepping carefully over the mound of displaced earth, and began to walk. The fog thickened around her, wrapping her in its grey embrace, hiding the tears that finally began to fall, cutting tracks through the dirt on her face. She would not go home, not yet. Home was a room with a silent cradle and walls that leaned in too close. Tonight she would hunt. The gate creaked as she pushed it open, the iron hinge protesting with a shriek that sounded dangerously loud in the stillness of the night. She froze, listening, but there was no answer from the shadows, no movement save for the swirling mist. Yet, as she stepped out onto the path that led towards the main road, a sensation prickled at the back of her neck, an instinct older than reason telling her she was not alone in the churchyard. Someone else was watching the grave. Someone else was waiting for her to leave so they could finish what they started. Sarah pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders, hiding the tremor in her hands, and walked faster, her eyes scanning the gloom ahead for the faint, yellow glow of a public house window. Yeast and sour ale hit her first, a wall of smell that stood up from the open door as soon as she stepped off the pavement. It clung to the curtains, thick with tobacco smoke and the damp wool of men who worked the river. Sarah paused on the threshold, letting her eyes adjust to the gloom inside, where the light from oil lamps struggled against the haze. She pulled her shawl closer, the black fabric absorbing the shadows rather than reflecting them, and pushed through the swing door. The noise inside did not stop, but it dipped. Heads turned. A woman in mourning black did not belong here, not alone, not at this hour. She kept her gaze fixed on the bar, on the man wiping a glass with a cloth that looked dirtier than the rim he polished. He was broad in the shoulder, his apron stained with spills that had hardened into crusts of brown and green. His eyes met hers, flat and knowing, before dropping back to the counter. Sarah approached. The wood beneath her palms was sticky, varnish worn away by elbows and coins. She did not speak immediately. Instead, she reached into the pocket of her dress and withdrew a shilling, silver, catching the lamplight for a brief second before she slid it across the grain. It stopped just short of his hand. "Fresh goods," she said. The words felt like gravel in her throat. Men with full pockets, speaking of it. The landlord stopped wiping. He looked at the coin, then at her, his expression unreadable. In this trade, silence was a currency more valuable than silver. To speak was to risk the gallows, to nod was to invite the constable. He set the glass down. The clink was sharp in the low murmur of the room. "None of that here," he said. His voice was low, a rumble that barely carried over the top of the bar. "We serve ale, we serve gin, we don't serve talk." "I lost a boy," Sarah said. She did not raise her voice. She let the grief sit there, raw and exposed, hoping it might crack the code of the wink that bound these men to their secrets. 3 days gone, fever took him, but the grave was empty this morning. The landlord's hand hovered over the shilling. He could take it and tell her nothing. He could take it and throw her out, or he could take it and keep the peace. He glanced towards the corner of the room, a movement so slight it might have been a twitch, before sliding the coin into his apron pocket. "Git," he muttered, but he did not move to eject her. He turned his back, busying himself with a row of bottles, leaving her standing in the space he had conceded. Sarah stepped away from the bar. Her legs felt heavy, as if the clay from the churchyard had seeped into her boots and hardened there. She moved along the wall, keeping to the shadows where the patrons sat in clusters, their voices dropping to whispers as she passed. They knew what she was, they knew what she wanted, and they knew who had taken him. In the corner booth, a glass of gin sat untouched. The liquid was clear, pale as urine, condensation beading on the outside of the vessel. It had been left recently. The warmth of the room had not yet stolen the chill from the glass. Sarah looked at the table. Beneath the base of the glass, a corner of paper protruded, white against the dark wood. She glanced around. No one was watching her directly, though she felt the weight of peripheral vision, the sense of being monitored by men who pretended to drink. She reached out. Her fingers trembled just once before she steeled them. She lifted the glass. It was light, almost empty. Underneath lay a scrap of ledger paper, torn hastily from a book, its ink smudged and written in a hand that looked hurried and shaky, the letters sprawling as if the writer had been interrupted or drunk. Lodging House, St. Giles, Coal Yard. There was no name, just the location, a direction. She folded the paper quickly, tucking it into her bodice where it pressed against her skin, cold through the layers of fabric. It was a coordinate, a destination, more than she had hoped for, yet less than she needed. It did not give her back Thomas. It did not return the warmth to his limbs or the color to his cheeks. But it gave her a place to point the law, provided the law could be made to care about a pauper's grave. She turned to leave. The landlord was watching her again, his face impassive, but his hand rested near the bell pull beneath the counter. A warning. She had her answer. To linger was to push her luck beyond the breaking point. Sarah nodded, a sharp dip of her chin, and walked towards the door. The air outside was colder than the pub, the fog rolling in from the river to meet her. She drew a breath that tasted of soot and damp brick, clearing the smell of stale beer from her lungs. The shilling was gone. It was more than she could afford, a week's worth of bread and coal spent on a whisper, but the paper against her ribs felt heavier than the coin had been. She began to walk. The streets were quieter here, the shadows deeper. Her footsteps echoed on the cobblestones, a solitary rhythm in the night. She needed to get home. She needed to write to Wakley. The name sat in her mind like a talisman, the editor of the Lancet, the man who shouted into the void about the trade in flesh. He would listen. He had to. As she turned the corner towards Bethnal Green, the fog thickened, obscuring the gas lamps until they were nothing more than halos of weak yellow light. She pulled the shawl tighter. The paper burned against her skin, a secret weight. Someone had written that address. Someone had left it where she might find it, or perhaps where anyone might find it. A mistake or a trap. She did not look back. To look back was to invite the fear in, to let it slow her pace. She walked faster, her eyes scanning the gloom ahead for the shape of her own street, for the safety of her tenement door. The address in her bodice felt like a promise kept, a first step on a road that would either end in justice or in the same ditch where they had left her son. The wind picked up, carrying the sound of the river, the slap of water against wood. Somewhere a cart wheel squeaked. Sarah flinched, pressing herself against the brickwork of a closed shop, holding her breath until the sound passed. It was only a delivery, likely milk or coal, but her nerves were raw, stripped bare by the grave and the pub. She reached the post box on the corner of her street. It was an iron pillar, dark and solid. She had the letter ready in her pocket, the wax still warm from the candle at home. She stopped before it, her hand hovering over the slot. To post, it was to commit. To send it was to declare war on men who killed for gold sovereigns. Sarah dropped the letter. It slid into the box with a soft clatter, vanishing into the dark interior. She stood there for a moment, watching the slot, as if expecting the letter to return. It did not. The transaction was complete. She turned towards her building, unaware that across the street, beneath the arch of a railway bridge that did not yet carry trains but served as a shelter for the homeless, a figure stood motionless. The man watched her go, remaining motionless until her door finally closed. Then he stepped from the shadows, his boots silent on the pavement as he walked towards the post box. He did not open it, for he had no need. He had seen where she came from and witnessed the look in her eyes. Sarah climbed the stairs to her room, the wood groaning under her weight. She lit a fresh candle, the flame flickering in the draught. On the table lay the empty space where her savings had been. She touched the spot where the coins had sat. They were gone, but the address remained. She sat down, the chair creaked. Outside, the city breathed, a slow, rhythmic expansion of fog and smoke. She waited for the sound of footsteps on the stairs, for the knock on the door that would signal the end of her inquiry. None came, not yet. The candle burned low. Sarah Goff did not sleep. She watched the door, her hands folded in her lap, the mud from the churchyard still under her nails. The room held the cold long after the fire had died, a damp chill that settled in the marrow of her bones and refused to shift. Sarah sat at the table, the wood scarred by years of knives and hot irons, her hands resting on the empty space where the coins had been, 3 shillings and 4pence. That was the sum of her world, the total value of her capacity to act. She counted them again, though she knew the number by the weight alone, the silver cold and heavy in her palm before she pushed them back into the pile. A constable would want more than that. A constable would want a guinea just to walk down the street, let alone to kick open a door in St. Giles and demand answers of men who carried knives in their boots. It was impossible. The arithmetic of justice did not balance for the poor, it never had. He reached for the quill, dipping it into the inkwell that sat near the candle stub. The ink was thick, nearly dry, and she had to scratch the nib against the rim to coax a drop of black fluid onto the paper. Her hand shook, not from the cold, but from a rage that felt too large for her chest, a pressure building behind her ribs that threatened to crack them open. She pressed the pen to the page. The scratch of the nib sounded loud in the silence, a harsh, grating noise like a beetle trapped in a box. Mr. Wakley, she wrote. The letters were jagged, lacking the looping grace of the lady's hand she had once tried toe double dot a umlaut before the fever took Thomas and the hunger took her strength. I have the place. She paused, lifting the pen. The candle guttered, the flame bending as if bowing to a draught that did not exist, casting her shadow huge and distorted against the peeling wallpaper. For a second, the silhouette looked like a giant reaching out, fingers elongated and grasping, a monster born of her own exhaustion. She blinked, and it was just a woman again, small and hunched over a table in a room that smelled of boiled cabbage and wet wool. They are at the lodging house in the coal yard, St. Giles. The landlord of the King's Head knows. He did not speak, but he let me see. She stopped, the ink pooling at the end of the sentence, a dark blob threatening to soak through the paper. How to explain the rest? How to make a man who wrote for surgeons understand that the law was a sieve that let the gold through but caught only the dirt? The law says a body is nothing, she wrote, the words tumbling out faster now, the handwriting deteriorating into a scrawl. It says you cannot steal what has no owner. So they take them, and the surgeons buy them, and everyone washes their hands and says it is for science. But my boy had a name. He had a mother, and they sold him for 8 guineas, while I count coppers to bribe a man who will not come. The candle sputtered, a wick drowning in its own wax. She leaned forward, shielding the flame with her cupped hand, feeling the heat against her palm, a sharp, stinging warmth. The room seemed to close in, the walls pressing tighter as the air grew thick with the smell of tallow and despair. She thought of the dissecting theatre at King's College, a place she had never seen but could picture with terrifying clarity, the bright lights, the clean tables, the men in aprons leaning over a body that looked like Thomas but was called a subject. They would cut him. They would take him apart to learn how the heart beat, unaware that the heart belonged to a boy who had liked the taste of peppermint and feared the dark. Her breath hitched, a ragged sound in the quiet room. She forced it down. Grief was a luxury she could not afford tonight. Grief would make her slow. Grief would make her weep, and tears would blur the ink and ruin the letter. She needed Wakley to read this. She needed him to feel the weight of it, the sheer, crushing injustice of a system that valued the education of the rich over the sanctity of the poor. She dipped the pen again, The ink was running low, the color fading to a watery gray. "They are still hunting," she added, the letters trembling. "I saw them, or I think I did. The fog makes it hard to be sure, but they are there, and they know I am asking." She signed her name, Sarah Goff. The letters looked foreign, detached from her, as if someone else had written them. She blew on the paper, waiting for the ink to dry, her eyes fixed on the name. It was all she had left to give. Her money was gone, her strength was fading, but her name was hers, and she would not let them take that too. She reached for the wax seal, a disc of red that sat hard and brittle on the table. She held it over the candle flame, watching the edge soften, then melt, a slow drip of crimson liquid falling onto the folded paper. It hissed as it hit, spreading into a pool of bright red that looked too much like blood in the flickering light. She grabbed the ring from her finger, the one Thomas's father had given her before he died in the mines, and pressed it into the soft wax. The metal was cold against the hot wax. She pushed hard, feeling the resistance, then the give. When she lifted the ring, the impression remained, a simple band, a circle with no beginning and no end. Her mark, her claim. Let them try to say the body had no owner now. She had stamped it with her own flesh, her own history. The candle flared one last time, a sudden burst of brightness that illuminated the room in stark, harsh relief, then dimmed to a tiny blue point before going out entirely. Darkness rushed in, immediate and absolute, filling the corners, creeping under the door. Sarah sat still, her hand resting on the sealed letter, feeling the warmth of the wax fading through the paper. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the loose pane in the window, a rhythmic tapping that sounded like fingers seeking entry. She did not move. She listened to the sound of the city, the distant rumble of carts, the shout of a drunkard, the endless sucking sound of the tide coming in. Somewhere out there, men were walking with sacks over their shoulders. Somewhere, a surgeon was sharpening a knife. And here, in the dark, a mother sat with a letter that might change nothing, or might change everything. She stood up, her joints stiff, and moved towards the door. The floorboards groaned under her weight, a complaint of old wood. She had to post it. The night was not over, the war had just begun. As her hand touched the latch, a sound froze her. Not the wind, nor the rats scuttling within the walls, but footsteps, heavy and deliberate, that stopped directly outside her door. The smell of lime hit him first, sharp and chemical, cutting through the damp wool of his scarf before he even stepped into the courtyard. Bishop shifted the sack on his shoulder, the weight uneven, dragging at his left side where the muscle had knotted since dusk. He stopped beneath the archway, the stone slick with condensation, and waited for the shadow to detach itself from the wall. "Later." The voice came from the darkness, young and tight, belonging to a man who knew the risk, but needed the goods more than he feared the gallows. Bishop did not set the burden down. Keeping it hoisted maintained the leverage, a physical reminder that the commodity was still in his possession, still under his control, until the gold changed hands. "Watchmen near the Strand," Bishop said, "had to circle round by the water." A lantern flared, the light sudden and yellow, illuminating the face of the junior demonstrator. He was pale, too clean for this hour, his hands tucked into the pockets of a coat that cost more than Bishop earned in a month of digging. The young man stepped forward, the hem of his trousers avoiding the mud with a precision that spoke of privilege, and reached for the sack without asking permission to touch it. Bishop stepped back. The movement was sharp, a warning. "Gold," Bishop said, "no notes." The demonstrator hesitated, his hand hovering in the empty air between them. "The bursar only issued banknotes. It is safer for the ledger." "Ledgers burn, gold spends." Bishop's voice was low, a gravelly rumble that matched the distant traffic of the river. "I do not carry paper that carries my name to the magistrate. Sovereigns, count them." A sigh, white breath pluming in the cold. The demonstrator reached into his coat and produced a leather purse, heavy and tight. He loosened the drawstring and tipped the contents into his gloved palm. The coins clashed, a bright metallic singing that sounded obscenely loud in the muffled quiet of the courtyard. Bishop watched the light catch the edges of the sovereigns, the king's head profiled in relief, worthless metal transformed into power by the stamp of the mint. "8," the demonstrator said, "as agreed for the freshness." "Freshness is your concern, not mine. I deliver, you pay." Bishop extended his own hand, bare and stained with earth, and took the purse. He did not count it. He weighed it. The heft was correct, the density of the gold settling into his palm like a promise of survival. He tucked the purse into his waistcoat, against the skin, feeling the cold metal warm instantly against his ribs. "Leave the sack," the demonstrator said, reaching for the burden again. This time Bishop allowed it. He slid the sack from his shoulder, the movement releasing a tension he had not acknowledged carrying. The canvas hit the flagstones with a dull, wet thud, the sound of meat dropping on a butcher's block. There was no shape to it, no defining feature, just a lump of humanity wrapped in rough cloth, indistinguishable from any other parcel of cargo in this city of trade. Demonstrator dragged it towards the door, the heels of his boots scraping on the stone. He did not look back. He did not offer a thank you. There was no gratitude in this transaction, only the relief of a duty completed, a supply chain satisfied. He pulled the door open, a heavy slab of wood reinforced with iron, and hauled the sack over the threshold. Inside, the light was brighter, gas lamps hissing overhead, revealing glimpses of tiled walls and drains that smelled of copper and bleach. Bishop watched him go. He stood in the shadows of the arch, hands deep in his pockets, fingers brushing the curve of the purse through the fabric of his waistcoat. The door closed. The latch clicked. The sound was final, a period at the end of a sentence that had begun in a grave in St. Giles and ended here, in the belly of the college. He turned away from the building. The fog had thickened while he waited, rolling in from the Thames to swallow the courtyard whole, reducing the world to a radius of 10 feet. He walked towards the gate, his boots sinking slightly into the mud that coated the cobbles, each step requiring a deliberate lift of the knee. The money was secure, but the comfort it promised was fleeting. He thought of the usurer in Clerkenwell, the man who held the notes on his lodging and knew too much about his movements. 8 guineas would cover the interest for another month, perhaps 2 if he lived frugally, but the debt itself remained, a stone around his neck that grew heavier with every passing week. The supply was the problem. He could feel it in his bones, a creeping anxiety that had nothing to do with the constabulary and everything to do with the earth itself. The churchyards were picking over. The watchmen were multiplying. Wakley's articles in the Lancet were stirring the public mood, turning a tolerated trade into a moral crusade, and the heat was rising. He could not dig fast enough to meet the demand of the surgeons, not without risking the noose. He reached the gate and pushed it open, the iron groaning on its hinges. The street beyond was empty, the fog obscuring the gas lamps until they were nothing but haloed ghosts in the distance. He paused there, looking back at the college, the dark mass of the building looming against the sky. Somewhere inside, the demonstrator was unpacking the sack. Somewhere, the body was being weighed, measured, catalogued. The law said a corpse had no owner, that it could not be stolen, yet here they were, buying and selling flesh as if it were coal or timber. The legal fiction did not matter to the dead. It mattered only to the men who profited from the silence. Bishop pulled his collar up against the damp. He needed to meet Williams. The split had to be made before the sun came up, before the city woke and the streets filled with eyes that might recognize the mud on his boots. He started walking, the pace steady, neither hurried nor slow. To run was to invite suspicion. To linger was to invite capture. Behind him, deep within the college, a sound carried through the thick walls, a thud, perhaps a body hitting a table, perhaps a tool dropped on tile. It echoed in the fog, faint and distorted, but Bishop heard it. He did not stop. He did not flinch. He simply adjusted the purse against his ribs and walked into the gloom, the sound following him like a shadow that refused to fade. The chandler's shop smelled of rendered tallow and stale cheese, a cloying warmth that stuck to the back of the throat. Bishop pushed through the curtains separating the retail floor from the back room, shaking the fog from his coat like a wet dog. Williams sat at the table, a map of the parishes spread before him, weighted down at the corners by empty whiskey bottles and a candle guttering in the draught. May leaned against the wall, arms crossed, watching the door with a sullen intensity that made Bishop's hand drift towards the purse tucked inside his waistcoat. "Shut it," Bishop said. May pushed off the wall. He did not speak, merely nodded towards the table where the wax had pooled into hard, white islands on the wood. Bishop approached and unloaded the purse, the leather drawstring loosening with a friction burn against his thumb. Gold spilled onto the map, sovereigns rolling across the printed names of churchyards until they settled in the valleys of the paper creases. The sound was bright, distinct, cutting through the low hum of the city outside. Williams reached for a coin, but Bishop slapped his hand away. The movement was sharp, a crack of skin on skin that echoed in the small room. "I count," Bishop said. "You always count." Williams rubbed the back of his hand, his eyes on the pile. "And you always find a deduction. Risk carries a price. I carry the sack. I face the demonstrator. You wait here with the bottle." Bishop began to stack the coins, building small towers of 3, his fingers moving with the dexterity of a banker, though his nails were rimmed with black earth. "May gets 2. You get 3. The rest covers the usurer and the bribe for the watchman at St. Sepulchre." May shifted his weight, the floorboard creaking under his boot. 2 is less than last week. Last week the ground was soft. This week it's frozen clay. I broke 2 spades. Bishop pushed a stack of 2 sovereigns across the map. They slid over the inked boundary of Bethnal Green and stopped before May's stained cuff. "Take it or leave it. But if you leave it, you walk alone next time." May looked at the coins, then at Bishop. The resentment sat in his jaw, a tight muscle working beneath the stubble, but he pocketed the gold without another word. He knew the truth of it. There were no other buyers. The surgeons at Kings and Guy's operated like a cartel, fixing the price, while the resurrection men fought over the scraps of the grave. To walk away was to starve, and hunger was a sharper master than any gang leader. Williams poured whiskey into a chipped mug, the liquid dark as blood in the candlelight. "There's a plot in Highgate, loose soil, fewer watchmen since the cholera cleared out the parish." "No," Bishop did not look up from his counting. "It's ripe, 30 fresh ones in the last month alone." "I said no." Bishop stacked the final tower, the gold gleaming against the dull paper of the map. "We stay in the east. We stay where we know the beadles and we know the locks. Moving north invites attention we cannot afford." Williams lifted the mug, but did not drink, saying instead that she sounded like a woman frightened of her own shadow, for the trade was good and the demand was high. "The demand is high because Wakley is screaming about it." Bishop swept the remaining coins into his own purse, the metal clinking softly as he tightened the drawstring. "Have you read the Lancet this week? He's printing names, not ours, not yet, but he's printing the prices, he's printing the roots. He wants to make the flesh so hot no surgeon dares touch it." "Let him print." Williams drank, the whiskey vanishing in one long pull. "Paper doesn't stop a spade. Paper puts a rope around your neck." Bishop stood, the chair scraping loudly against the floor. He felt the weight of the gold against his ribs, a comfort that was already turning to ash. The usurer in Clerkenwell would take half of this before dawn, leaving him with enough for food and lodging but nothing for safety. The debt was a living thing, feeding on his labor, growing faster than he could dig. "We lay low, 3 days, no digs, no sales, let the watchmen get bored." May spoke from the corner, his voice low, rough with disuse. "There's a man asking questions." Bishop froze. The purse hung from his hand, heavy and sudden. He turned slowly, fixing May with a stare that offered no mercy. "What man?" "In the pubs, around St. Giles," May said, looking at his boots and unwilling to meet Bishop's eyes, before adding, "Asking about the carts, asking about the fog." "Constable." "No, civilian. He wears a coat too fine for the rookeries, with ink staining his fingers." May shifted again, the movement nervous, like a horse sensing a storm. "He buys drinks and listens more than he talks, for someone said he writes for the papers." Williams laughed, a harsh bark that died quickly in the tallow-scented air. "Spying journalists. Next you'll say the dead are rising to complain." "He asked about the Italian boy," May said. The room tightened. The candle flame dipped, casting long, dancing shadows against the stacks of soap boxes lining the walls. Bishop felt a coldness seep into his chest, unrelated to the damp of his clothes. The Italian boy was recent, too recent. The body had been warm when they sold it, a premium price paid for a life extinguished perhaps only hours before. If someone was asking about that specific cargo, the circle was closing tighter than he had calculated. "What did you tell him?" Bishop's voice was quiet, dangerous. "Nothing, I gave him the wink." May tapped his eye, the gesture automatic, a reflex of the trade. "But he keeps coming back tonight, since he was at the Queen's Head." Bishop moved to the table, and extinguished the candle with his thumb and forefinger. Smoke curled up, acrid and sharp, joining the gloom that was already pressing against the windows. Darkness swallowed the room, leaving only the faint grey light from the street filtering through the grime on the glass. In the dark, the sound of breathing was louder, the presence of the other two men suddenly feeling less like partnership and more like liability. "Go home," Bishop said. "What about the Highgate job?" Williams asked, his voice coming from the shadows. "There is no job, not until I say." Bishop moved towards the curtain, his hand brushing the wall to guide him. "Lock the door behind you. If the man comes back, you tell me. You do not speak to him. You do not drink with him. You bring him to me." "And if he offers gold?" May asked. The question hung in the dark, insolent and testing. Bishop paused, his hand on the fabric of the curtain. He could hear the street outside, the rumble of a cart, the distant shout of a watchman calling the hour. The city was awake, hunting, always hunting. "Then you're a fool," Bishop said, "and fools end up on the slab they sell to." He pushed through the curtain and into the shop, leaving them in the black. The bell above the door jingled as he stepped out into the night, the cold air hitting his face like a slap. He did not look back. He walked fast now, ignoring the risk of suspicion, the purse clutched tight against his body, the ink on the stranger's fingers, the question about the Italian boy. Wakley's articles were not just print. They were a net, casting wider every day, and he had been swimming in the center of it without knowing the mesh was tightening. He turned the corner towards Clerkenwell, the usurer's house looming in his mind like a gallows. He needed to pay the debt. He needed to silence the journalist. He needed a subject that would fetch enough to buy immunity. The thought arrived fully formed, unbidden, terrifying in its clarity. A fresh one, a stranger, no one to ask questions. Bishop touched the knife in his pocket, the handle worn smooth by use. The leather strap waited at home, ready for the steel. Strap hung from a nail in the lath plaster wall, a loop of cured hide stiff with old oil and the grey dust of sharpening stones. Bishop sat on the edge of the mattress, the springs groaning under his weight, the single tallow candle guttering on the floorboards where it cast a weak, sickly light against the peeling wallpaper. He drew the knife from his pocket. The blade caught the flame, a sliver of cold fire in the warm room, and he laid the steel against the leather with a pressure that required no haste. "SHHHHK." The sound was dry, rhythmic, a whisper that filled the small space between the ticking of the watch on the mantel and the distant, drunken shouting from the street below. He pulled the edge towards him, then pushed it away, the motion practiced until it lived in the tendons of his wrist rather than the conscious mind. 8 guineas. The number floated in the dark behind his eyelids, bright and demanding. A stiff from the grave yielded 3, maybe 4 if the soil had not rotted the clothes, but a fresh one, a warm one, commanded the higher price without argument from the demonstrators at King's. They wanted the muscle pliable, the blood still fluid in the veins, the organs untouched by the slow decay of the earth. He stopped sharpening. The silence rushed back in, heavy and suffocating. Sarah Goff's face emerged from the memory of the public house, not as a ghost, but as a woman made of sharp angles and wet eyes, her hands clutching the edge of a table as if it were the only solid thing in a world turning to water. She had spoken of a child, a boy small enough to fit in a sack, yet large enough to carry a name that could unravel a man. Her grief was not the passive weeping of the bereaved, it was a hunt. She was walking the streets, asking the beadles, pressing coins into the palms of sextons, looking for a box that would never arrive at her door because under the law, the box did not belong to her. A corpse was nobody's property. It was a thing without an owner, a piece of meat waiting for a buyer, and the law cared nothing for the mother who had pushed it from her body. Bishop resumed the stroke. SHHHHK. The usurer in Clerkenwell would not accept excuses. Debt was a geometry of violence, precise and unyielding. If the payment was short, the consequence was not a letter, but a broken leg, or a fire in the night, or a visit from the constables with a warrant dug up from some forgotten grievance. He needed the gold tonight, or at least the promise of it solid enough to hold the wolf from the door for another week. Grave robbing was too slow, the ground too hard with the early frost, and the watchmen too numerous since Wakley had started printing his sermons in the Lancet. The journalist was turning the public eye into a lantern, sweeping it across the churchyards, illuminating the fresh mounds of earth that should have been undisturbed. But murder left no mound. The thought sat in his stomach like a stone, cold and heavy. It was not a thunderclap of revelation, no sudden moral collapse accompanied by shaking hands or a racing heart. It was a calculation, simple and arid. If the boy was already dead when they found him, they were resurrection men, liable for a misdemeanor, a few months in Newgate if caught lifting the shroud. If the boy was alive when they met him, and died by their hand to ensure the freshness of the commodity, they were murderers, and the rope waited at Newgate regardless of the shroud. The distinction was a razor's edge, walked every day in the fog of St Giles. S-H-H-H-H-K. He tested the edge with his thumb, feeling the bite of the steel against the callous skin, sharp enough to part the skin of a throat before the victim could draw breath to scream, sharp enough to make it quick. The Italian boy had been quick. He remembered the weight of that small body, the lack of resistance, the terrifying ease with which a life could be extinguished and converted into currency. The demonstrators had not asked questions. They had weighed the sack, counted the sovereigns, and dragged the prize into the dissecting theater where the gaslights burned bright and the smell of formaldehyde masked the scent of sin. Was the journalist asking about the Italian boy because he suspected murder or because he suspected theft? Wakley wrote of ethics, of the sanctity of the grave, but he knew the law as well as any barrister. He knew that to hang a man for stealing a corpse was impossible. He had to prove the killing. He had to find the intent. Bishop stood up, the knife still in his hand, the leather strap swaying gently on the nail where it would settle back into stillness. He walked to the window and peered through the grime into the street. The fog had thickened, rolling off the river to coat the cobblestones in a wet, yellow blanket that swallowed the gas lamps whole. A figure moved down the alley, a shadow detached from the wall, pausing beneath the flickering light of a street vendor's stall. The man wore a coat that was too fine for this part of town, the collar turned up against the damp. He held something in his hand, a notebook perhaps, or a press of papers. Ink on the fingers. Bishop's grip on the knife tightened, the knuckles whitening in the dim light. The figure looked up, sweeping his gaze across the windows of the lodging house, the look passing Bishop's pain as if seeing nothing but the reflection of his own desperate face. Then the man moved on, disappearing into the yellow soup of the fog, his footsteps muffled by the mist. The room felt smaller now, the walls pressing in, the air thick with the smell of tallow smoke and the metallic tang of the blade. Bishop turned back to the table and set the knife down on the wood, the point aimed towards the door. He would not sleep. Sleep was a vulnerability, a surrender to the dark where the ghosts of the dissected waited to whisper names to the living. He would sit here, sharpening the steel until it was a mirror, until it could cut the very air, waiting for the morning to bring a new opportunity, a new stranger, a new solution to the equation of debt and survival. The city outside continued its low, restless hum, the sound of thousands of souls breathing in the dark, unaware that some of them were already priced and tagged for the slab. Bishop picked up the strap again. S-H-H-H-H-K. The rhythm returned, steady and relentless, marking the seconds until the next job, the next sale, the next step towards the gallows or the gold. Dust motes danced in the single shaft of afternoon light that pierced the gloom of the British Museum's mineralogy room, swirling like tiny, frantic spirits trapped in glass. Thomas Wakley stood before the long oak table, his coat damp from the street, smelling of wet wool and the coal smoke that clung to London's skin. He did not speak immediately. The air here tasted different, dry and chalky, stripped of the river's rot. "Show me again." The voice belonged to Mr. Pritchard, a man whose fingers were permanently stained with ochre and graphite, nails broken short from digging into the earth of 100 countries. He leaned forward, spectacles sliding down the bridge of a nose red from the cold, and extended a magnifying lens over the small packet of paper Wakley had placed upon the wood. Inside lay a pinch of grayish clay, gritty to the touch, scraped carefully from beneath the fingernails of Sarah Goff's dead child before the coffin lid was nailed shut for the second time. "It is not Bethnal Green," Pritchard murmured, his eyes narrowing as he scrutinized the granules. The soil there is brick earth, soft, full of flint nodules and the debris of old kilns. This, he prodded the sample with a steel probe, the metal clicking softly against the glass slide. This bites back. Wakley felt a tightening in his chest, a physical constriction that had nothing to do with the cramped quarters or the lack of fresh air. He watched the geologist's hands, steady and sure, separating the grains with a precision that felt almost surgical. If Pritchard was wrong, the thread snapped. The investigation dissolved into the fog, just another sermon in the Lancet that the authorities would ignore while the surgeons sharpened their knives. "Explain the bite," Wakley said, his voice low, roughened by days of shouting over the din of printing presses and the wails of widows. "Quartz, sharp, angular quartz, mixed with a heavy deposit of London clay that has been disturbed, churned." Pritchard looked up, meeting Wakley's gaze with an intensity that bordered on fear. "And lime, not the natural chalk of the subsoil, but burnt lime, mortar dust. This earth comes from a place where the ground has been dug over repeatedly, where old foundations are crushed into the new dirt. It is the signature of St. Giles." St. Giles, the name hung in the dry air, heavy with implication. The parish was a warren of alleys and rookeries, a place where the poor piled upon the poor until the very ground seemed to groan under the weight of their misery. It was miles from Bethnal Green. A body buried in one could not simply wander to the other. "You are certain?" Wakley asked, though he already knew the answer. The certainty sat in his gut like a swallowed stone. "Certain enough to swear to it in a court of law, if such a thing were possible for dirt." Pritchard pushed the slide away, wiping his hands on a rag that was already black with grime. "The mineral composition is distinct. Whoever dug that grave in Bethnal Green did not fill it with the soil they removed. They brought earth from St. Giles to cover the theft, or perhaps—" he trailed off, leaving the darker thought unspoken. "Or perhaps the body had been moved, taken from a grave in St. Giles, transporting across the city, and reinterred in Bethnal Green as a decoy, a false flag to mislead the grieving mother and the watchful constables." The complexity of the deception spoke of a professionalism that chilled Wakley more than the winter wind outside. These were not desperate men scavenging for shillings. They were architects of a trade built on the violation of the sacred. Wakley pulled his notebook from his pocket, the leather cover worn smooth by constant handling. He uncapped his pen, the nib scratching loudly in the silence as he recorded Pritchard's findings. "St. Giles clay, mortar dust, angular quartz." The words looked stark on the page, a forensic map drawn in ink. He underlined the location twice, the pressure of the pen tearing the paper slightly. "This links them," Wakley said, more to himself than to the geologist. "It places the violation in St. Giles, regardless of where the body was found. It proves movement. It proves intent." "Intent is a matter for the magistrates," Pritchard replied, turning back to his shelves of labeled jars, each containing a different slice of the world's geology. "I deal only in what the earth gives up. The rest is your burden, Mr. Wakley." The burden, it felt heavier now, weighted with the specific gravity of the soil under his scrutiny. Wakley capped his pen and slipped the notebook back into his coat. He thanked Pritchard with a curt nod, the formalities feeling inadequate against the magnitude of the discovery. The geologist did not look up, already lost in the silent company of his stones. Wakley turned and walked towards the door, his boots making no sound on the wooden floorboards. The hallway outside was cooler, the light dimmer, filtered through high windows that looked out onto the grey sky. He moved quickly, his mind racing ahead of his feet, connecting the dots between the clay, the missing boy, and the surgeons who paid gold for fresh meat. The geological finger marks were the key that unlocked the door between the misdemeanor of grave robbing and the felony of murder. If the body had been moved, if the earth was a lie, then the story of natural death was a lie too. He pushed open the heavy oak doors of the museum and stepped out into the street. The air hit him like a physical blow, thick with the smell of horse manure, roasting chestnuts, and the ever-present damp of the Thames. Carriages rattled past, their wheels splashing through the mire, spraying mud onto the pavement. Wakley ignored the filth, clutching his coat closed against the wind. The data was tangible now, no longer a suspicion whispered in dark corners, but a fact written in the language of the earth itself. He could feel the shape of the argument forming in his mind, the structure of the article that would shake the foundations of the medical establishment. He would print the analysis. He would name the parishes. He would force the public to see the geography of the crime. A shadow detached itself from the wall of the museum further down the street, a figure standing motionless beneath the awning of a closed bookstall. Wakley's stride did not falter, but his senses sharpened, the hairs on the back of his neck rising in instinctive warning. The figure wore a dark coat, the collar turned up, hands buried deep in the pockets. As Wakley passed, the man did not move, did not speak, did not even turn his head. Yet the stillness was wrong. It was the stillness of a predator waiting for the prey to stray too far from the herd. Wakley kept walking, his pace steady, his hand drifting inside his coat to rest near the notebook where the truth lay written. The fog was rolling in off the river, swallowing the street lamps one by one, turning the afternoon into a premature twilight. He needed to reach the safety of his office, to commit the findings to print before the trail went cold again. Behind him, the sound of a footstep crunched on the gravel, soft but distinct, matching his own rhythm. Wakley did not turn. To look was to admit the fear, and fear made a man slow. He lengthened his stride, weaving into the throng of Fleet Street where the omnibuses lumbered like drunk beasts and the pedestrians jostled one another in the mire. A wall of bodies, perfect. He slipped between a fishmonger carrying a tray of glistening cod and a nursemaid pushing a perambulator with a broken wheel, ducking into the shadow of a printing house archway. The footsteps behind hesitated, confused by the sudden fragmentation of the crowd, then faded into the rattle of carriage wheels. Safe for now. He pushed on to Bow Street, not for justice, but for paper. The magistrate's clerk knew him, knew the ink-stained leverage of the lancet, and waved him through the wooden gate without asking for a warrant. The office smelled of stale tobacco and damp wool, a scent that clung to the papers stacked in teetering piles on every available surface. Wakley ignored the theft reports and the drunkenness charges. He pulled the box marked missing. Most were children, chimney sweeps who had climbed up and never come down, girls from the country promised positions in service who vanished upon arrival. He dug deeper, his fingers blackening with the grime of the files, until he found the notice pinned beneath a request for a lost watch. Carlo Ferrari, Italian, 12 years, last seen Strand selling matches. The date was 3 weeks past. No body recovered, no coroner's inquest, just a gap in the world where a boy had been. Wakley tucked the paper into his coat, the edge digging into his ribs, and set out for the address listed in the margin. A lodging house off Drury Lane, the kind where men slept sitting up to save on the cost of a bed. The landlord was a woman with arms like a dockworker, wiping her hands on a stained apron. She let him pass only after he showed the notice and a sovereign that vanished into her apron pocket with practiced speed. The room was on the second floor, shared by 4 others who had known the boy. One man sat on the edge of a straw mattress, staring at the floorboards. He looked up when Wakley entered, his eyes red-rimmed and hollow. "Carlo's friend?" Wakley asked. The man nodded, a jerky motion. "Giuseppe. Tell me about him." He was small, quick. Giuseppe's voice was rough, scraped raw by grief or gin, as he noted how the boy sold all the boxes and always came back with coppers. "Did he have any marks, scars?" Giuseppe lifted a hand to his own face, tracing a line beneath his chin where a fall in Geneva had left its mark. "Here," he said, "a piece of glass stayed in the skin." Wakley's breath caught, sharp and sudden. He saw it. The dissection theatre at King's College, the smell of spirits and rotting flesh, the body laid out on the slate slab. He had stood over it while a demonstrator pointed out the musculature of the neck. He remembered the chin, a white line against the pale skin, distinct as a crack in porcelain. He had thought it a birthmark. Now it was a signature. "Did he sick up before he went?" Wakley pressed, demanding to know if there had been a cough or a fever. "No," Giuseppe shook his head hard, strong like an ox. "He went out to sell matches. He did not come back. If he died naturally, there would be a record, a burial." "The rich have records." Giuseppe spat on the floor, the glob landing near Wakley's boot. "The poor have the pit, or the surgeons." The word hung in the damp air, heavy with accusation. Wakley gripped the edge of the table to steady himself. The geological evidence from the museum proved the body had been moved, transporting from St. Giles to Bethnal Green. This testimony proved the boy was alive when he vanished. Alive when he was taken, the law said a corpse could not be stolen, that it held no property value. That was the shield the resurrection men hid behind. But if the boy was killed to be sold, the shield shattered. This was no longer a misdemeanor, it was capital murder. He was warm, Wakley said, the words tasting of ash, for they had sold him while he was still warm. Giuseppe looked away, picking at a loose thread on his trouser leg. We know, we all know, but who listens to us? I will. Wakley turned and left the room before the man could ask questions that had no answers. The staircase groaned under his weight, the wood soft with rot. Outside, the sky had bruised purple, the light failing fast. He stepped onto the pavement, the cool air hitting his face like a slap. The notebook in his coat felt heavier now, weighted with the life of the Italian boy. He walked without seeing the street, the image of the scarred chin superimposed over the bustling crowd. The medical establishment would claim ignorance. They would say they bought from agents, that they asked no questions of the supply chain. They would hide behind the ambiguity of the law, the grey zone where a body was neither property nor person. But Wakley held the thread that stitched the grave to the theatre. The clay from St. Giles, the boy from the Strand, the scar on the chin. He needed the logbook. He needed to see the entry that matched the date of Carlo's disappearance. King's College lay ahead, its stone facade looming through the fog like a fortress. They would not want to show him. They would cite confidentiality, privilege, the sanctity of science. Let them. He would bring the crowd with him. He would print the names. A carriage passed, splashing mud onto the hem of his coat. Wakley did not brush it off. He kept walking, his hand resting on the notebook where the truth lay written. The game had changed. He was no longer hunting thieves. He was hunting killers. At the corner of Strand, he paused to light a match, the flare brief and sulphurous in the gloom. He checked the time on his pocket watch. The college gates would close soon. He had one chance to demand entry before the night watchmen barred the doors. He struck the match against the sole of his boot, the flame catching, and moved towards the river. The iron gates of King's College stood shut, the porter's lodge dark save for a single tallow candle guttering in the draught. Wakley did not knock. He shoved the wicket gate until the latch screamed, the metal biting into his palm, and stepped into the courtyard where the fog clung to the cobblestones like wet wool. Stop there. The voice came from the shadows of the portico, dry and brittle as old parchment. A figure emerged, tall and gaunt, clutching a greatcoat tight against the damp chill. It was Mr. Partridge, the senior demonstrator, a man whose hands were permanently stained with silver nitrate and formalin spirits. He did not look pleased to see the editor of the Lancet looming in his entranceway at twilight. Mr. Wakley, Partridge said, the name dropping like a stone into a well. The anatomical theatre is closed. Students have departed. I am not here for the students. As Wakley advanced, his boots struck the stone with a rhythm that brooked no argument. I require the acquisition register, the logbook for November. Partridge shifted his weight, blocking the door to the main hall with a subtle, practiced ease. That is college property, confidential. You know the statutes as well as any man. We do not open our records to the press, however distinguished the editor might claim to be. Open it. No, Partridge's chin lifted, a flash of institutional arrogance cutting through the gloom. We operate under the protection of the law. The bodies we receive are lawfully obtained from agents who swear to their provenance. To expose our suppliers would be to cut off the very lifeblood of medical science in this metropolis. You would have students learning anatomy from diagrams while the city rots with ignorance. Wakley stopped 3 paces from the man. The smell of the river was strong here, mixed with the chemical tang of the dissection rooms seeping through the brickwork. He thought of Giuseppe's hand tracing the scar on his own chin. He thought of the boy, Carlo, sold for 8 guineas while still warm. You speak of science, Wakley said, his voice low, vibrating in the narrow space between them. I speak of murder. Partridge flinched. The word hung there, ugly and specific, stripping away the academic veneer. Do not be melodramatic, sir, for we buy what is offered. If a resurrectionist brings a subject, We pay the market rate. What happens before the cart reaches our gate is no concern of the college. It becomes your concern when the subject bears the marks of violence inconsistent with natural death. Wakley pulled the notebook from his coat, its leather cover slick with rain, to reveal the story of an Italian boy, 12 years old, who carried a linear, glass-induced scar beneath his chin. He had vanished from the Strand 3 weeks ago. There was no death certificate, no coroner's inquest, yet he appeared on your slate. Partridge's eyes darted to the side, towards the darkened windows of the lecture hall. Many boys wander the streets, many die of consumption, you cannot provia. I can prove he was alive when he left his lodging. Wakley took another step, forcing the surgeon to retreat or be physically crowded, and added, I can prove he was sold to you within 48 hours of his disappearance. That is not resurrection, Mr. Partridge, that is butchery, and you are the buyer. The law states a corpse has no owner, Partridge snapped, his composure cracking like thin ice. Though we commit no theft, the act of exhumation is a misdemeanor, nothing more, we are within our rights. The law does not protect the sale of a murdered man. Wakley's voice rose now, echoing off the stone walls, carrying out into the street where a stray dog skittered away from the noise. If I print the names of every surgeon who accepted a fresh subject this month, if I list the dates and the conditions described by the agents, the public will tear this college apart. They will not care for your statutes then, they will care for their sons. Partridge gripped the lapels of his coat, his knuckles white. You would ruin us. You would halt the teaching of surgery for 1,000 students based on a suspicion. Not a suspicion, a fact. Wakley tapped the notebook. I have the geological evidence placing the body in St. Giles before it reached Bethnal Green. I have the witness who saw him alive. All I lack is the entry in your book that ties the date of purchase to the date of death. Give me the logbook, and I may yet spare the college the full weight of my editorial. Refuse, and tomorrow morning, every newsstand from Cheapside to Holborn will carry the story of the Italian boy butchered for your dissection table. Silence stretched between them, thick and suffocating. Somewhere in the distance, a church bell tolled the hour, the sound muffled by the fog. Partridge looked at the gate, then back at Wakley, calculating the cost of reputation against the cost of complicity. The fear of the hangman's noose did not touch him, but the fear of obsolescence, of being cast out by the very profession he served, clearly did. The logbook is in the office, Partridge said finally, his voice stripped of its earlier steel. But I warn you, Wakley, the entries may be incomplete. Agents are often vague with details. Show me. Partridge turned, his shoulders slumped, and produced a key from his pocket. The metal clicked in the lock, a sharp, final sound. He pushed the heavy oak door open, revealing a hallway lit by a single oil lamp that cast long, wavering shadows against the wainscoting. Follow me, the surgeon muttered, not looking back, and make it quick. The night watch will be making their rounds shortly. Wakley crossed the threshold, the air inside stale and cold, smelling of dust and old paper. He kept his hand on the notebook, feeling the pulse of the city outside fade as the door swung shut behind them, sealing him in with the dead and those who profited from them. Partridge led the way down the corridor, his footsteps hurried, as if he hoped to reach the office before his conscience caught up with his feet. At the end of the hall, the surgeon paused before a narrow door, inserting the key with a trembling hand. He pushed it open, gesturing to a ledger bound in black calf lying on a desk beneath a window that looked out onto the darkened river. There, Partridge said, stepping back into the shadows of the doorway. November is there, take what you need, but remember you saw nothing else. Wakley moved to the desk, the wood smooth and cold under his fingertips. He opened the ledger, the pages rustling loudly in the quiet room. The ink was fresh on some entries, still glistening slightly under the lamplight. He ran his finger down the column of dates, searching for the gap, the lie, the proof that would turn a misdemeanor into a hanging. He found it. The entry was hurried, the handwriting jagged, male subject, unknown, received Nov 14, 3 days after Carlo vanished. Wakley uncapped his pen, the nib poised over his own notebook, ready to copy the damning line. Behind him, the floorboard creaked, not the shift of Partridge's weight, something else, a presence in the hall that had not been there a moment before. He did not turn. He kept writing, the scratch of the nib loud and deliberate, but his muscles coiled tight, waiting for the shadow to detach itself from the wall. Damp stone, the smell of urine soaked into straw that had gone black with age. Thomas May sat on the bench, knees drawn up to his chest, arms wrapped tight around his shins, as if holding himself together against the cold seeping up from the floor. Bow Street held the night in its throat, swallowing the cries of the street outside, until only the drip of water from the ceiling remained, regular as a clock marking time he did not have. A key turned in the lock. Metal grated against metal, sharp and sudden in the close air. The door swung inward, hinges complaining with a rusted shriek that set May's teeth on edge. A constable stepped through, carrying a lantern that cast long, wavering shadows against the whitewashed walls. The man was broad-shouldered, his uniform coat buttoned high against the chill, the brass buttons dull in the low light. He did not speak immediately. Instead, he closed the door behind him with a heavy thud, sealing the cell once more, and leaned his hip against the wood, watching May with eyes that had seen too many men walk to Newgate. "Comfortable, are we?" The voice was low, devoid of pity. May lifted his head, the movement stiff. His neck protested, muscles locked from hours of sitting in the same position, waiting for the hammer to fall. "Charge me or let me go." Soon enough, the constable pushed off the door, boots crunching on the grit scattered across the flagstones. He stopped 3 feet from the bench, close enough for May to smell the tobacco on his breath, mixed with the sour tang of gin. Assault on a watchman, trivial, you'd serve a month, maybe 2, if the magistrate feels ungenerous. May said nothing. He knew the weight of the accusations sitting unspoken between them. The assault was a net to catch fish, nothing more. The real catch lay beneath the surface, in the grave they had robbed and the bodies they had sold. "But there are other matters," the constable continued, shifting the lantern to his left hand so the light fell fully on May's face. "Matters involving the sale of flesh, murders committed to supply the surgeons, those carry a different penalty." "The law says a body ain't property," May said, her voice rough and unused, as if the words scraped against a throat long silent. "Digging ain't a felony, and everyone knows it." "Everyone knows wrong." The constable crouched, bringing his face level with May's. The light deepened the hollows under his eyes, making him look like a skull wrapped in skin. "Exhumation is a misdemeanor, true, but kill a man to sell him, that's murder, and murder brings the drop. 12 feet of rope, Thomas, enough to stretch the neck until the windpipe crushes flat." May looked at his hands. They were dirty, the nails rimmed with earth that no amount of scrubbing would remove. Soil from St Giles, clay from Bethnal Green. He remembered the weight of the sack on his shoulder, the limp heaviness of the lad they had taken from the lodging house. He remembered the gold coins Bishop had pressed into his palm, warm from the surgeon's office, spent quickly on drink and women who asked no questions. "Bishop says nothing," May muttered. "Bishop says nothing because he thinks you'll hold the line." The constable stood, brushing dust from his trousers. "But Bishop isn't sitting in this cell. He isn't feeling the damp rot his boots, while the magistrates build a case on testimony from a man who wants to breathe another winter." The lantern flame flickered, casting dancing shapes against the wall. May watched the light, unable to meet the constable's gaze. He thought of the code, the wink that bound them all. Silence was currency, worth more than the guineas they split, but currency meant nothing if you were dead. "They're watching the lodgings," the constable said quietly, noting that every pub from here to the river is under scrutiny along with every bridge. "They know where he sleeps. They know where Williams drinks, making it only a matter of time before the net tightens." May shifted his weight, the straw crunching beneath him. The cold had reached his spine now, a deep ache that settled between the shoulder blades. He thought of the Italian boy, the one they had taken near the market. Fresh, warm, worth 8 guineas instead of 3. He remembered the bludgeon in Bishop's hand, the quick, sickening crack that ended the life before the body was even cold. They had told themselves it was mercy, a quick end for a subject destined for the knife anyway. "Loyalty won't stop the hangman," the constable said, reading the hesitation in May's posture. "Only truth does that. The first man to speak gets immunity, the second gets the noose. Which are you?" May closed his eyes. The image of the gallows rose unbidden, The crowd gathered in the dawn mist, the cart rolling away, leaving a body swinging in the air. He had seen it before, seen the twitching legs, the face turning purple then black. He had laughed then, safe in the crowd. Now the rope felt close, tightening around his own throat with every breath he drew. "Bishop will kill me. Bishop will be in irons before he finds you." As the constable straightened and lifted the lantern, the shadows retreated, shrinking back into the corners of the cell. "Think on it. The magistrate comes in the morning, and he wants names as well as details, not just the digging, the killing." He turned towards the door, key already in hand. "Wait," May's voice cracked. The constable paused, hand on the latch. He did not turn back. "If I speak," May said, staring at the dirt under his nails, "if I tell you how it happened, the bludgeon, the sale, you guarantee safety. I guarantee you walk out of here when the others walk to the scaffold." The constable's voice was flat, devoid of promise, but heavy with fact. "But you must be first. The second man gets nothing." The key turned. The door opened, letting in a sliver of light from the corridor, bright and harsh against the gloom of the cell. May squinted, shielding his eyes with a trembling hand. He looked at the open door, then at the constable's back, broad and immovable in the frame. "Go," the constable said. "Tell me when you're ready to save your neck." He stepped out, leaving the door ajar so that the light remained, cutting across the straw floor as a path out of the darkness. May stared at it, the choice sitting heavy in his gut, heavier than the gold he had spent, and heavier still than the secrets he had kept. Outside, footsteps approached, heavy, deliberate, and unmistakably not the constable's return, for they belonged to someone with authority. May stood, legs stiff, and moved towards the light. The footsteps halted outside the threshold, heavy leather on stone, deliberate and slow, marking time against the pulse, hammering in May's ears. A silhouette filled the gap where the constable had stood, broader than the first man, carrying the scent of snuff and old paper that clung to the coats of the bench. This was no turnkey. The magistrate stepped into the cell, the candle in his hand casting a long, wavering shadow that swallowed the straw where May had been sitting. He did not sit. Authority rarely took a chair in a place like this. "You understand the position," the magistrate said. His voice was dry, devoid of the constable's persuasive menace, replaced by a bureaucratic certainty that felt heavier. "We have the witnesses for the digging. We have the surgeons willing to testify regarding the purchase. What we lack is the moment of death." May said nothing. His throat had closed, tight as a purse string. "Exhumation is a nuisance, a misdemeanor." The magistrate placed the candle on a crate, the flame guttering as the draft caught it. "Murder is a felony, and felony brings the hangman. I require the distinction. Did the Italian boy breathe when you carried him?" "No," the word fell out of May's mouth before he could catch it. "Then how did he cease to breathe?" The question hung in the damp air. May looked at the magistrate's hands. They were clean. The nails were trimmed, the skin pale, untouched by the clay of Bethnal Green or the soil of St Giles. These hands wrote warrants. They signed death warrants. They did not dig grave. May looked down at his own fingers, the earth ground into the cuticles, permanent stains that no soap would lift. He thought of Bishop, the code, the wink. Silence was the only currency that held value in the markets of the dead, a coin spent to buy safety among thieves. But safety meant nothing if the rope waited at the end of the transaction. "He was alive," May whispered. "The admission tasted of copper and bile. When we took him from the lodging house, he was warm." The magistrate dipped a quill into an inkwell he had carried in his pocket. The nib touched the paper. A dark line began to form, bleeding into the fiber as the magistrate waited for more. "Go on." Bishop struck him. May's voice gained strength, driven by the desperate need to purge the memory. A bludgeon wrapped in cloth to dull the sound. One blow landed behind the ear. He gestured vaguely towards his own head, fingers trembling, as the victim fell like a sack of wheat without struggle. We told ourselves it was quick, better than the fever taking him slow. Where was the body sold? King's College. The name felt like a betrayal of a different sort, dragging the institution into the mud. The surgeon paid 8 guineas, fresh, warm. The price is higher for those who haven't stiffened. The quill moved across the page. The sound was not a scratch but a drag, steel pulling through wet ink, leaving a permanent record of the treason. Each stroke sealed a fate. May watched the hand moving, mesmerized by the finality of it. Once the ink dried, there was no taking it back. Bishop would hang, Williams would hang, and May would walk, carrying the weight of their deaths in his gut for whatever years remained. You are aware, the magistrate said, not looking up from the paper, that giving this testimony places you outside the protection of your associates. There is no returning to the trade. There is no returning to the streets where they have friends. I know. And you accept immunity in exchange for this deposition. May swallowed. The air in the cell felt thick, saturated with the smell of unwashed bodies and the sour tang of fear. He thought of the gallows at Newgate, the drop calculated to break the neck rather than strangle. He thought of the crowd baying for blood, their faces upturned like flowers seeking the sun. He would not be one of them, not this time. I accept. The magistrate stopped writing. He lifted the quill, a drop of ink clinging to the tip, hovering over the page before falling to spoil a letter. He did not blot it. He let the imperfection stand, then sign. He pushed the paper across the crate. May stepped forward, his boots crunching on the straw. He took the quill. It felt light, insubstantial compared to the spade he usually held. The handle was smooth wood, worn by other hands, other confessions. He pressed the nib to the paper. His name looked strange in the looping script, detached from the man who wrote it. Thomas May, a witness, a traitor, a survivor. The magistrate took the paper back, blowing gently on the wet ink to hasten the drying. He folded it once, then twice, and placed it inside his coat against the heart. The constable will escort you. We have a location, for Bishop and Williams are lodging near the river, and we need you to identify the house. May nodded. He could not speak. The confession had emptied him, leaving a hollow space where his loyalty used to be. Come, the magistrate turned, picking up the candle. The light swung, casting wild shapes against the walls as he walked towards the corridor. Time is short. They move often. May followed. He stepped out of the cell, into the corridor where the air was slightly less foul. The constable waited there, hand on the hilt of a truncheon, eyes hard. There was no sympathy in the man's face now. May was no longer a prisoner to be managed. He was a tool to be used. He walked beside them, the sound of their boots echoing on the stone flags, marching towards the street where the fog waited to swallow them all. Outside, the night had deepened. The fog rolled in from the Thames, thick and yellow, clinging to the cobblestones and obscuring the gas lamps until they were no more than halos in the gloom. A carriage waited at the curb, black and boxy, the wheels sunk slightly into the mud of the road. The magistrate climbed in first. May hesitated on the pavement, looking back at the dark mouth of Bow Street, the place where he had signed away his soul. Get in, the constable said. May climbed into the carriage. The leather seat was cold beneath him. He looked out the window as the driver whipped the horses, the wheels lurching forward into the mist. They were going to hunt them down. The thought brought no joy, only a grim necessity, like digging a grave in winter when the ground is frozen solid and the pickaxe jars the arm with every swing. He folded his hands in his lap, keeping them out of the light, hiding the dirt under the nails that would never wash clean. The wheels hammered against the cobblestone, a rhythmic bruising that traveled up through the soles of May's boots and settled in his knees. Inside the cabin, the air smelled of stale tobacco and the damp wool of the magistrate's coat. May kept his hands folded in his lap, fingers interlaced tight enough to turn the knuckles white, hiding the dirt under the nails that would never wash clean. Outside, the fog pressed against the glass like a living thing, thick and yellow, swallowing the gas lamps until they were no more than halos in the gloom. Keep your head down, the magistrate said. His voice was flat, devoid of the ceremonial weight it carried in the courtroom. When we stop, you remain here until instructed. May nodded. He could not bring himself to look at the man opposite. The magistrate sat with the detached curiosity of a naturalist observing a specimen pinned to a board, watching May with eyes that reflected nothing but the cold light of the lantern swinging above them. It was a transaction, nothing more, a life for a life. May had sold Bishop and Williams for the chance to see another sunrise, and the cost of it sat heavy in his gut, a stone swallowed whole that would never digest. The carriage slowed. The driver shouted something unintelligible to the horses, the whip cracking sharp against the night air. Wheels groaned over a patch of mud, the vehicle lurching to a halt that threw May forward against the leather strap restraining him. He caught himself on the seat edge, palms scraping the rough fabric. "This is the vicinity," the magistrate said, yet he did not move to open the door, pointed out quickly. May leaned towards the window. He wiped a circle on the condensation with his sleeve, the wool leaving a smear of grease on the glass. Through the cleared patch, the street emerged like a memory half remembered. The river was close. He could smell the mud and the rotting kelp, the distinct odor of the Thames at low tide mixing with the coal smoke hanging over the water. There on the corner, a building with a broken shutter on the first floor. A drinking house, though the signs were down now. "That one," May said. His voice sounded thin, swallowed by the carriage walls. "The door with the iron latch." The magistrate rapped on the roof with his cane. 2 sharp clicks. Immediately, the shadows detached themselves from the walls outside. Constables emerged from the mist like ghosts materializing from the ether, their truncheons drawn, boots silent on the wet pavement. They moved with a practiced efficiency, spreading out to cover the exits, ensuring there would be no escape through the rear alley or the window overlooking the yard. May watched them go, feeling a mix of relief and shame that he could not fully articulate, knowing he had signed death warrants for men he called brothers. The fog rolled in thicker, obscuring the street, creating a theater of shadows where the arrest would take place, the atmosphere heavy with the anticipation of violence. "Stay seated," the constable guarding the carriage door said. He stood outside, hand on the handle, blocking May's exit. "Do not open this unless I tell you." May sank back into the leather. The seat was cold beneath him, leaching the warmth from his body through the thin fabric of his trousers. He closed his eyes, unable to watch the raid, listening only to the sounds of the street as the constables took their positions. A dog barked somewhere in the distance, a lonely sound that echoed off the brickwork of the warehouses lining the wharf. The wind picked up, whistling through a crack in the window frame, carrying the scent of rain and river slime. He thought of Bishop inside that house, perhaps sleeping, perhaps counting the gold sovereigns hidden in a loose brick behind the fireplace. Bishop would not expect this. The code of the resurrectionist was built on silence, on the understanding that the grave kept its own secrets and the men who dug them kept theirs. But May had broken the circle. He had let the light in, and now the darkness was rushing to fill the space where their loyalty used to be. A shout erupted outside, muffled by the glass but distinct enough to make May flinch. It was a command, sharp and authoritative, followed by the heavy thud of boots running across the cobbles. Then silence again, but a different kind, tense and waiting, like the breath held before a sneeze or a blow. May gripped the edge of the seat, his fingernails digging into the stuffing. He wanted to stand, to look, to see the end of it, but he forced himself to remain still, staring at the pattern of the floorboard beneath his feet. Dust motes danced in the light of the lantern, swirling in the draught from the window, indifferent to the violence about to unfold mere yards away. "Ready yourselves," the constable outside whispered. His voice was low, meant only for the men surrounding the house. "On my mark." May heard the shift of weight as the officers tensed, ready to breach. He thought of the Italian boy, the warmth of him when they lifted him from the bed, the way the blood had pooled dark and thick on the floorboards of the lodging house in Nova Scotia Gardens. That blood had led them here. It had soaked into the soil and risen up through the roots of the city to strangle them all. There was no washing it off. No amount of soap or lye would remove the stain of what they had done. And now the reckoning was at the door. "Now," the constable said. The crash of wood splintering tore through the night, loud as a pistol shot in the quiet street. May squeezed his eyes shut, his breath catching in his throat as the shouts began, a cacophony of anger and fear rising above the sound of the struggle inside. He heard Bishop shouting curses against the traitors, his voice filled with a rage that chilled May's blood, confirming that there was no going back to the life they once led. The constables returned to the carriage, confirming the capture, and May was told he would be moved to a secure location to protect him from the gang's associates who might seek revenge. He looks out the window at the foggy street, realizing he is now a prisoner of the state as much as he was a prisoner of the trade. The typesetting room smelled of sour beer and hot lead, a cloying fug that stuck to the back of the throat like wet wool. Wakley stood over the galley tray, his fingers blackened with ink, watching the compositor slide a fresh line of type into the chase while the press groaned in the corner, a mechanical beast hungry for paper. A runner burst through the door, hatless and gasping, his chest heaving as if he had sprinted the entire length of Holborn without drawing breath. He thrust a folded scrap of paper towards Wakley, the edges damp with rain and the sweat of a nervous palm. From Bow Street, the boy wheezed, doubling over to rest his hands on his knees. They have them, both. Wakley snatched the note, tearing the seal with a thumb that trembled not from cold, but from a sudden, violent surge of fear that felt too much like hope. He swept his gaze across the scrawl, the magistrate's hand hurried and jagged, confirming that John Bishop and Thomas Williams were now locked in the condemned cells, their hands bound, their mouths shut tight against the noose that waited at Newgate. The noise of the printing house, the rhythmic clatter of the press, and the low murmur of men setting type seemed to drain away, leaving a vacuum so profound it made his ears ring. He looked up, finding the eyes of the foreman, a man who had set type for the Lancet since its first issue and knew the weight of every word they published. "Stop the press," Wakley said, his voice cutting through the haze of smoke and oil. "Kill the lead article and pull the forms." The foreman froze, a composing stick half raised in his hand, the metal glinting dull in the gaslight. "Sir, the edition goes to the bundler in 20 minutes. The carriers are already loading the carts outside." "I said stop it," Wakley repeated, stepping around the tray and knocking a pile of galleys to the floor with a clatter that made the younger apprentices jump. "We are not printing a sermon on public health today. We are printing names." He moved to the desk, seizing a quill and dipping it into the inkwell with such force that a drop splattered onto his waistcoat, a dark star blooming on the grey fabric. The paper scraped beneath the nib as he rewrote the headline, the letters forming sharp and aggressive, demanding space on the page where moralizing had stood only moments before. Bishop, Williams, London Burkers. The words were not just information. They were an accusation, a verdict delivered before the trial had even begun, designed to ensure that when the jury sat, they would feel the breath of the city on their necks. He wrote of the Italian boy, Carlo Ferrari, naming the victim whose body had been the commodity that broke the camel's back, whose murder transformed a misdemeanor of grave robbing into a felony of blood. "Set this," Wakley commanded, as he slammed the sheet onto the compositor's stand. "Make it bold." He demanded that it be made impossible to miss. The foreman read the copy, his lips moving silently as he parsed the syntax, then nodded once, a grim acknowledgement of the shift in tides. He signaled to the pressmen, who halted the great wooden arms of the machine, the sudden silence heavy and expectant, filled only by the hiss of the gas jets and the distant rumble of cart wheels on the cobbles outside. Men moved with practiced urgency, unlocking the chasers, lifting the heavy iron frames that held the type, and replacing the old editorial with the fresh, damning accusation Wakley had just scratched into existence. The air grew thick with the scent of hot metal and oil as the rollers were inked again, preparing to bite into the white sheet and stain it with truth. Wakley stepped back, wiping his hands on a rag that was already stiff with dried ink, watching as the first proof was pulled. The paper emerged warm and steaming slightly in the chill air, the black letters stark against the fiber, smelling of the chemistry that made news permanent. He took the sheet, holding it up to the light, checking the alignment, ensuring that the names of the murderers sat heavy at the top of the column, anchoring the page just as they would soon anchor the gallows. This was the weapon he had forged over months of investigation, the culmination of whispers in pothouses and terrified letters from grieving mothers in Bethnal Green who had found their children's grave violated and empty. It was no longer a hunt for ghosts. It was a reckoning with flesh and blood men who thought the law too clumsy to catch them. "Run 500, he ordered, turning towards the window where the frost was beginning to feather the glass. "Get them to the distributors before the morning coaches leave." The press started again, the rhythm returning, faster this time, a frantic heartbeat driving the news out into the waking city. Wakley walked to the window, pressing his forehead against the cold pane, looking down at the street where the distribution carts were being loaded. The horses stamped their hooves on the frozen mud, steam rising from their nostrils in white plumes that mingled with the breath of the workers throwing bundles of the lancet into the wicker baskets. Soon these papers would be in the hands of clerks and surgeons, of magistrates and shopkeepers, spreading the story of the capture like a contagion that no quarantine could contain. The outrage he had cultivated, the slow-burning fury of a public that sensed the rot beneath their feet, would now ignite into a flame that could not be extinguished by legal technicalities or the quiet bribes of the anatomy schools. He watched a carrier whip his horse, the cart lurching forward into the mist, the wheels crunching over the ruts in the road. Somewhere out there, Sarah Goff was waking to another day without her son, her grief a private country that no arrest could reclaim. Yet today the world would acknowledge that her loss was not merely a statistic in a parish register, but a crime demanding blood. The distinction mattered. Under the common law, a corpse was nobody's property, a thing that could be dug up with only a slap on the wrist, but a murdered man was a different matter entirely, a violation that carried the rope. Wakley had forced the issue, dragging the conversation from the abstract rights of surgeons to the concrete reality of a boy struck down for profit. A draft slipped through the window frame, carrying the smell of coal smoke and the distant, briny tang of the Thames, a reminder that the city was a living organism that digested its own inhabitants. He turned from the glass, looking back at the chaotic energy of the print room, the men working under his direction to ensure that the record was set before the politicians in Westminster could sanitize the trade with their new act. If the legislation passed before the hangings, the moral clarity would blur, the state itself becoming complicit in the commerce of the dead. But today, for this one day, the line was drawn in ink and iron. Bishop and Williams would not be remembered as suppliers of science, but as butchers who had overreached. The foreman approached, holding a fresh bundle of the printed sheets, the ink still glistening wet. "First batch is away, Mr. Wakley. The rest will follow within the hour." "Good," Wakley said, taking the top sheet and folding it carefully, tucking it into his coat pocket against his heart. "See that a copy goes directly to the Crown prosecutors, and another to the Home Secretary." He moved towards the door, the floorboards creaking under his boots, the sound of his departure signaling the end of the investigation and the beginning of the trial. The city outside was waking up, unaware that the ground beneath it had shifted, that the shadows in the churchyards had finally been dragged into the light. He stepped out onto the pavement, the cold air biting at his face, and looked towards the east where Newgate stood, a grim silhouette against the grey sky. The hunt was over. The cage was shut. Now came the hard part of making sure the key was thrown away. The date of the trial was set for December 2nd, looming over the city like a storm cloud that promises to break with thunder. The iron gates of Newgate loomed ahead, black against the bruised sky, swallowing the light from the street lamps before it could touch the stone. Wakley picked his way through the mud, boots sinking into the rutted thoroughfare where carts had churned the earth into a slurry of horse dung and coal ash. He did not hurry. Rushing suggested fear, and he carried no fear today, only a cold, hard certainty that sat in his gut like a swallowed stone. The crowd parted for him without knowing who he was, sensing the purpose in his stride, the way a shark clears water around it. At the lodge, the turnkey looked up from a ledger stained with grease and ink. The man's face was pockmarked, skin like rough parchment stretched over bone, eyes dull from years of watching men rot in the dark. He did not ask for business. The name Wakley carried weight enough to open locks that money could not pick. "The Burkers," Wakley said. The turnkey dipped his quill, scratching a note that would vanish into a file never read by living eyes. He stood, keys clattering at his hip, a heavy ring of iron that sounded like chains dragging on flagstones. He led the way without a word, the candle in his hand casting long, dancing shadows that made the walls seem to breathe. Down they went. The air grew thick, tasting of vinegar and unwashed wool, of human waste trapped in straw that had not been changed in weeks. Dampness seeped through the soles of Wakley's boots, a cold creep that climbed his legs and settled in his joints. The corridor narrowed, walls closing in until the ceiling brushed the top of his hat, forcing him to duck slightly, a physical bow to the gravity of the place. Somewhere a man coughed, a wet, tearing sound that echoed off the stone and died without pity. They stopped at a door reinforced with bands of iron, the wood swollen with moisture. The turnkey fitted a key, turned it with a grunt of effort, and pushed. The hinges screamed, a high metal shriek that set Wakley's teeth on edge. Bishop sat on a cot that was little more than a plank raised on bricks. He looked up, face unwashed, beard matted with grease, but his eyes were clear and hard as flint. There was no repentance there, no tremor of a man facing the rope. He looked at Wakley as one merchant might look at another across a counter, assessing value, calculating risk. The turnkey remained by the door, hand resting on the hilt of a truncheon that had seen more use than the law intended. He did not speak, merely watching, a statue carved from the same grey stone as the walls. Wakley stepped inside, the space so small he could have touched the opposite wall with an outstretched arm. The smell was acute here, concentrated, the scent of a man who knew his time was short and saw no reason to wash for the grave. Carlo Ferrari, Wakley said, the name hung in the damp air, heavier than the smoke from the turnkey's candle. You sold him to King's College. Bishop shifted, the straw on his cot crunching under his weight. He picked at a loose thread on his coat, a garment that had once been fine, but was now stained with the grime of the cell and the trade. Sold nothing, Bishop said, his voice low and rasping as if he had swallowed dust. Found him, dug him up like the rest. He was warm. Does a grave keep a clock? Wakley leaned forward, hands clasped behind his back to stop them from reaching out and shaking the truth from the man's throat. He needed a confession, not for the court, but for the record, for the history books that would say the lancet broke the ring of silence. The boy had no marks of the grave, no soil under the nails, his skin unbroken save for the throat. Wakley paused, letting the accusation settle. You struck him for 8 guineas. Bishop looked away, focusing on a crack in the wall where moisture had drawn a map of nowhere. He smiled, a thin stretching of lips that did not reach his eyes. The expression was worse than a denial. It was an admission of a different kind, an acknowledgement that the game was played by rules Wakley could not rewrite with ink. Prove it, Bishop said. The words were flat, devoid of challenge or anger, serving merely as a statement of fact. While the law declared a corpse to be nothing and stealing it a misdemeanor, killing for it meant death. They would hang for murder only if the Crown could prove breath still lingered in the boy when they took him, a gap in the statute that Bishop knew as well as Wakley did. He sat in it. Wakley straightened, the movement sharp. He had expected resistance, perhaps even lies, but this calm acceptance of the moral void was a different thing entirely. It confirmed what the letters from Bethnal Green had whispered, what the soil on the boots had suggested. These men did not see themselves as thieves, they were suppliers. You will hang, Wakley said, and your bodies will feed the tables you sold to. Bishop's eyes flicked back to him. For a second, a shadow passed over the face, a crack in the stone. The irony landed. The dissection of the executioner's victim was the final seal on the contract, the ultimate commodity cycle closing upon itself. He said nothing. He simply resumed picking at the thread on his coat. Wakley turned. He had what he came for, though it was not words. The silence was testimony enough. The turnkey stepped forward, ushering him out. The door swung shut, the lock engaging with a solid clunk that vibrated through the floor and up Wakley's legs. The sound was final, a period at the end of a sentence written in blood. He walked back through the corridors, the air seeming lighter now, though the smell remained clinging to his coat. The turnkey peeled away at the lodge, returning to his ledger without a glance, the transaction complete. Wakley pushed out into the street, the daylight grey and welcome against his eyes. The cold hit him first, scrubbing the prison stench from his senses. He took a deep breath, the air sharp with coal smoke and the distant salt of the river. His hands were cold, fingers stiff, and he shoved them into his pockets, feeling the folded paper of the print shop-proof against his thigh. He did not head back to the press. The printing was done. The public would read the names. Now the work shifted from the street to the desk, from the hunt to the trap. He needed the logbook from King's College. He needed the soil samples analyzed by the geologist. He needed to build a wall of evidence so high that no legal trickery could climb it. Wakley walked west, against the flow of the morning crowd, his mind already arranging the papers on his desk, stacking the exhibits in the order they would be presented to the Crown. Bishop could keep his silence. The earth would speak. The office smelled of stale tobacco and the sharp, acidic tang of wet ink. Wakley shook the rain from his coat before crossing the threshold, leaving a dark patch on the floorboards that would stain the wood if not scrubbed. He did not call for a maid. The work required his hands alone. On the desk, the logbook from King's College lay open, leather binding cracked, pages yellowed at the edges. He ran a finger down the column of dates, stopping at the entry for November. Subject received, condition fresh. The handwriting was neat, clinical, devoid of the violence required to maintain such freshness. Beside it, he placed the geological report. A small packet of paper contained soil samples scraped from the boots seized at the lodging house in Nova Scotia Gardens. Bethnal green clay differed from the earth at the college dissection theatre. One held the grit of the river, the other the loam of the grave. Proof of movement, proof of transit. A knock rattled the wood. Wakley tucked the soil packet beneath the logbook. Enter. Two men stepped inside, shaking umbrellas against the frame. John Clarkson and Thomas Phillips, the Crown's counsel. They carried the weight of the Old Bailey in their posture, shoulders hunched against the burden of precedent. Clarkson removed his hat, revealing hair powdered with the dust of the street, while Phillips remained standing, eyes scanning the room as if searching for hidden listeners. "You sent word urgency," Clarkson said. He moved to the fireplace, warming hands that were already red from the cold. "Urgency is the only currency left," Wakley replied, tapping the logbook. "We cannot charge them with theft, for the common law is clear. A corpse holds no property value. If we argue they stole the body, we grant them a misdemeanor, just a few months in Newgate. Then they return to the trade." Phillips shifted his weight. The floorboard creaked. "The magistrates prefer simplicity. Theft is easily understood by a jury. Murder requires proof of intent, proof of the moment of death. Intent is written in the flesh." Wakley opened the folder containing the surgeon's notes from the identification. Ferrari showed no signs of decomposition, no grave soil under the fingernails. The ligature marks on the neck were fresh. They did not dig him up. They drowned him or struck him for the premium price. Clarkson turned from the fire, where the heat had brought a flush to his cheeks that contrasted sharply with the pallor of the room. 8 guineas for a warm subject. We know the price. Proving they paid it is one thing, yet proving they killed him to secure it is another. The defense will argue he died of natural causes in the street. They will say the burkas merely found him. Then we show the bruises. Wakley leaned forward, palms flat on the desk. The wood felt cold through his shirt sleeves. Subcutaneous bleeding consistent with blunt force shock before life ceased. Liston will testify. He has seen enough butchered meat to know the difference between a corpse handled and a life extinguished. Phillips sighed, a long exhalation that fogged in the chill air. He walked to the desk, looking down at the papers without touching them. "If we fail on the murder count, we lose them entirely. The public wants blood, Wakley, but the law requires certainty. If we hang them on insufficient evidence, the surgeons lose their supply and the public loses faith in the courts." "The public has no faith to lose." Wakley's voice dropped, low and rough. "They know what happens in the dark. They know their children are safe only until the fog rolls in. Give them the truth. Charge the murder." Clarkson exchanged a glance with Phillips. A silent communication passed between them, the kind forged in courtrooms where lives were bartered for legal technicalities. Phillips nodded once. "Very well," Clarkson said. "We frame the indictment around the death of the foreigner. We bypass the property law entirely. The body is not the stolen goods. The life is the victim." Wakley exhaled. The tension in his shoulders loosened, a knot untying itself after weeks of strain. He reached for the inkwell, dipping the quill. The nibs scratched against the paper as he wrote the time of the meeting, the names of the counsel, the agreement reached. A record, another layer of armor against the appeals that would surely come. "The trial date?" Phillips asked. He was already moving towards the exit, eager to return to the warmth of the chambers. "December 2nd, Wakley said. He did not look up from the page. "Old Bailey, morning session." 2 weeks. As Clarkson pulled on his gloves, the leather creaked. "Prepare your witnesses and ensure Liston knows his lines, for the defense will tear him apart if he hesitates. They will hear the truth. Truth is what the jury believes." Clarkson tipped his hat. "Good day, Wakley." They left, the door closed softly, lacking the violence of the prison lock earlier that day. Wakley sat alone. The ink on the page glistened, wet and black. He blew on it gently, watching the sheen dull as it dried. December 2nd. The date settled in the room, heavy as a stone. He reached for the stack of correspondence on the corner of the desk. Letters from families, names of the missing, requests for information that he could not provide. His hand hovered over the pile, then stopped at a specific envelope. Coarse paper, addressed in a shaky hand, Sarah Goff, Bethnal Green. She had written 3 times since the disappearances began, each letter shorter than the last. The hope draining out of the ink. He could not promise her the body would be found. The anatomy tables did not give back what they consumed. But he could tell her the men were caught. He could tell her justice was coming, even if it arrived too late to matter. Wakley pulled a fresh sheet of paper towards him. The quill felt heavy in his hand. He dipped it again. The nib hovered over the white surface, waiting. Outside, the city continued its noise, the rumble of carts and the shout of hawkers drifting through the closed window. None of it touched the silence in the room. He began to write, the scratch of the nib the only sound, marking the distance between the law's victory and a mother's loss. The trial would begin in 14 days. The hangman would do his work shortly after, but for the woman in Bethnal Green, the clock had stopped weeks ago. Wakley sealed the letter with wax, pressing his signet ring into the soft red pool until it hardened. He rang the bell for the messenger. The rope frayed at the end. He pulled it twice. The noise hit first, a physical wall of sound that shoved against the eardrums before the door even opened. Not the polite coughing of a parish vestry or the shuffled feet of a Sunday congregation, but the raw, wet heat of 300 bodies packed into a space meant for half that number. Air thickened by breath and unwashed wool hung low, tasting of sour yeast and the damp clay tracked in from the streets outside. Thomas Wakley forced his way through the crush near the back, shoulder-checking a man in a fustian jacket who smelled of gin and tallow, until he found the narrow ladder leading to the press gallery. Up here, the view was a panorama of hats. Top hats, tricorns, flat caps, all bobbing like corks on a choppy sea as the crowd surged forward, desperate to see the meat of the spectacle. Wakley climbed. His boots slipped on the worn wood, the rung biting into his palm. He hauled himself over the railing and collapsed into the single bench reserved for the lancet, the wood hard against his spine. Below, the well of the court yawned, a pit of oak and shadow where the fate of men would be decided by the quality of their lies. He opened his notebook. The paper felt rough under his thumb, cheap stock that would soak up ink if he pressed too hard. He did not press hard. He held the quill ready, a spear waiting for the charge. Silence in the court. The cry tore through the murmuring, sharp as a whip crack. The clerk of arraigns stood by the bar, his face flushed purple, veins bulging in his neck as he glared at the gallery. The noise did not stop so much as it fractured, breaking into 1,000 whispered fragments that buzzed like flies around a carcass. Hats were doffed, not out of reverence, but out of the instinctive fear of authority that kept the poor alive in this city. The side door groaned open. 2 figures emerged, shackled together at the wrist, the iron chain clinking a dull rhythm against the silence. John Bishop walked first, his head high, eyes sweeping his gaze across the gallery with a look that was neither defiance nor fear, but a cold, commercial assessment. He looked like a man checking the quality of goods at Smithfield Market, weighing the crowd, calculating the price of their attention. Behind him stumbled Thomas Williams, smaller, softer, his gaze fixed on the floorboards as if counting the knots in the wood to keep from vomiting. Wakley's pen moved. Bishop enters. Composed, Williams trembles. They were led to the dock, a wooden cage that smelled of old sweat and the lingering terror of those who had stood there before them. The turnkey unlocked the chain, the metal scraping loud enough to make several women in the front row flinch. Bishop rubbed his wrist, rotating the joint, then leaned against the rail as if he owned the timber. He caught Wakley's eye in the gallery. For a second, the editor held the gaze. seeing nothing human behind the pupils, only the blank calculation of a trade that viewed flesh as currency and life as inventory. Bishop looked away first, turning to whisper something to Williams that made the smaller man shrink further into his coat. "Bring in the jury," the judge commanded. His voice was dry, devoid of ornament, the voice of a man who had sentenced too many to the hangman to waste breath on ceremony. 12 men filed in, tradesmen mostly, their faces ruddy from the heat of the room and the importance of the moment. They took their places in the box, shuffling papers, adjusting collars, avoiding the eyes of the accused. One man, a baker by the look of the flour dusted into the creases of his waistcoat, stared directly at Bishop with an expression of pure, unadulterated hatred. It was the look of a father who had checked his own child's grave more than once, fearing the earth had been turned too fresh. Wakley noted the baker's hands, clenched on the rail with knuckles gone white. Good. Let them feel it. Let the jury remember the mud on their boots and the violation of the churchyard, the chilling knowledge that no one was safe once the candle was snuffed. The clerk began the swearing-in process, the drone of the oath filling the space between the gasps of the crowd. "You shall well and truly try." The words rolled on, a legal incantation meant to sanctify the violence about to occur. Wakley watched the lips move but listened to the room. A woman in the corner sobbed, a short, choked sound that was immediately swallowed by the shuffle of feet. A man too rose down, cleared his throat, a harsh, barking noise that echoed off the plaster ceiling. Bishop shifted his weight, the movement fluid, almost lazy. He knew the law. He knew that under the common law, a corpse was nobody's property, that digging up a body was a misdemeanor punishable by a few months in Newgate, a slap on the wrist for a profession that paid 8 guineas for a warm stiff. He had operated in that grey space for years, protected by the legal fiction that the dead could not be stolen. But the charge today was different. The indictment did not speak of theft. It spoke of murder. It spoke of the Italian boy, Carlo Ferrari, whose throat had not been cut by disease, but by a blow from a blunt instrument, his life extinguished to create a commodity that fetched a higher price. The distinction hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. If they were merely resurrection men, they were nuisances. If they were murderers, they were meat for the rope. Wakley's hand hovered over the page. He needed to capture the shift in the room, the moment the public realized this was not about grave robbing, but about the slaughter of the living to feed the schools. He wrote, "The atmosphere curdles, not curiosity now, hunger for blood." The judge adjusted his wig, the horsehair scratching against his neck. He looked down at the dock, his expression unreadable, a mask of judicial neutrality that hid whatever personal revulsion he might feel. "Prisoners at the bar," he said, the words dropping into the silence like stones into a well. "How say you, guilty or not guilty?" Bishop stepped forward. The chain rattled. He did not look at Williams. He did not look at the judge. He looked at the crowd, at the sea of faces that had come to watch him die, and he smiled. It was a small thing, a twitch of the lip that never reached the eyes, but it was enough to make the baker in the jury box tighten his grip on the rail until the wood creaked. "Not guilty," Bishop said. His voice was clear, carrying to the back of the gallery without effort. "We done nothing but what the surgeons paid us to do." A murmur rippled through the court, a wave of shock that broke against the walls. Williams whispered something urgent, his head down, but Bishop ignored him. He stood tall, a martyr for the medical establishment, throwing the complicity of the profession into the face of the court. Wakley's pen flew across the page, the ink splattering slightly as he raced to capture the defiance. This was it, the crack in the code. The moment the resurrectionist code of silence shattered under the weight of the gallows. Bishop was already bargaining, trying to drag the surgeons down with him, hoping that if he tainted the buyers, the seller might be spared. It would not work. The law needed a sacrifice, and the city needed a hanging. The judge banged his gavel, the sound cracking like a pistol shot. "Order, I will have order in this court." The noise subsided, grudgingly, leaving a tension so thick it felt like the air before a thunderstorm breaks. Wakley stopped writing. He rested the quill on the edge of the notebook, watching Bishop. The man looked calm, too calm, as if he had already accepted the rope and was merely waiting for the length to be measured. Below in the well, the prosecution counsel began to arrange his papers, the rustle of parchment sounding unnaturally loud in the stillness. He did not look at Bishop. He looked at the jury, specifically at the baker, locking eyes with the man who represented the outrage of the parish. The game had begun. The first witness would be called soon, a man named May, who had sold his soul for immunity and would now sell his mates for survival. Wakley leaned forward, elbows on his knees, the notebook balanced precariously. He could smell the damp wool of the man next to him, the stale tobacco smoke trapped in the gallery rafters. He could feel the pulse of the city beating through the floorboards, a rhythm of anger and grief that demanded satisfaction. The trial of the century was not about justice in the abstract. It was about whether a poor Italian boy counted as a person or merely as stock. The clerk cleared his throat again, preparing to call the first name. Bishop turned his head slightly, looking towards the door where the witness would enter. For the first time, a flicker of something human crossed his face. Not fear, not regret, but a sudden, sharp awareness that the code he had lived by was about to be rewritten in blood. The door creaked open. A figure stepped into the light, pale and shaking, holding onto the rail as if it were the only thing keeping him from the floor. Thomas May, the betrayer. The room held its breath, waiting for the first word that would seal the fate of two men and expose the rot at the heart of the medical trade. Wakley dipped his pen. The inkwell was nearly empty, the black liquid clinging to the nib like tar. He would need more before this was done, much more. May's hand trembled as he touched the Bible. The leather cover was worn smooth at the corners, stained by the grease of 1,000 sworn lies and occasional truths. He did not kiss the book. He merely nodded, a jerky movement of the chin, and turned to face the jury. His coat hung loose on his frame, the fabric shiny at the elbows, suggesting a man who had spent more time leaning over bars than standing upright in respectable company. Wakley's nib hovered above the paper, waiting for the first syllable to land. "State your name," the prosecution counsel said. "Thomas May," the voice cracked on the second syllable. "And your occupation?" A pause, long enough for the gallery to shift in their seats, the wood groaning under the weight of impatient bodies. "Laborer." "You were present at the lodging house in Nova Scotia Gardens on the night of the 5th of November. May swallowed. The Adam's apple bobbed like a cork in dirty water. "I was." "Did you see the prisoner Bishop strike the deceased?" "Yes." The word dropped into the well of the court and sank without a ripple. Bishop remained still in the dock, his hands clasped behind his back, but Williams shifted his feet, the iron shackles scraping against the floorboards. A harsh, grating sound that set Wakley's teeth on edge. He wrote quickly, the ink flowing dark and wet. "May admits presence, does not flinch from the blow." "Describe the strike," the counsel pressed. "Blunt instrument, iron bar maybe." May looked at his own hands, as if checking them for blood that had long since been washed away. One blow, behind the ear, he dropped like a sack of grain. No gasp from the crowd. They had come for meat, and now they had it. The details of the violence were not shocking to a city accustomed to the casual brutality of the streets, but the cold precision of the description landed heavy. Wakley watched the baker on the jury. The man's jaw tightened, a muscle jumping beneath the skin. He was thinking of his own children, likely, thinking of how easily a life might be extinguished for the price of a good coat. Defense counsel rose. The silk of his gown rustled, a soft counterpoint to the tension in the room. "Mr. May," he began, his voice smooth, oiled, "you stand here today under a grant of immunity. Is that correct?" "It is." "So if you speak words that please the prosecution, you walk free. If you speak truths that displeases them, you hang." May looked up, and for the first time, his eyes met Bishop's, finding no apology there, but only a flat, desperate survival instinct. "I'm speaking what happened." "Are you?" The counsel stepped closer to the witness box, looming over the smaller man. "Is it not true that you have a history of theft, that you have been imprisoned for receiving stolen goods?" "Once." "And you would lie to save your own neck, would you not?" "Everyone would." The admission drew a low murmur from the gallery. Wakley stopped writing. He watched Bishop. The resurrectionist's face had hardened, the mask slipping to reveal a flash of pure venom. He had expected silence. The code of the resurrectionist was absolute. You took the rope before you turned king's evidence. May had broken the covenant. He had traded loyalty for breath. The prosecution intervened. Did the prisoner speak after the blow was struck? May nodded, said the body was warm, said it would fetch 8 guineas. Yes. And a stale body from the graveyard. 3, maybe 4. The arithmetic of the grave hung in the air. 3 guineas for digging up the dead, 8 for making them so. The distinction was the crux of the entire case, the pivot upon which the law would turn. If the body was merely stolen, it was a misdemeanor. If it was made, it was murder. Wakley underlined the numbers in his notebook. Price differential establishes motive. Defense counsel shook his head. Conjecture, you cannot know the price agreed. I heard it, May said. His voice was steadier now, the initial shock worn off by the rhythm of the questioning. I counted the sovereigns, gold, heavy coins. Bishop put them in his pocket without counting. He knew the weight. Wakley leaned back, the chair creaking beneath him. The detail of the weight was damning. A man who counts coins suspects the value. A man who knows the weight trusts the source. It suggested a routine, an established commerce of flesh that went deeper than a single night's work. He glanced at the judge. The old man's eyes were closed, though Wakley knew he was listening to every cadence, weighing the credibility of the witness against the enormity of the charge. Did you see the body removed? Yes. Where was it taken? King's College. The name landed like a stone dropped in a quiet pond. Ripples spread through the gallery. Heads turned towards the press section, where the surgeons sat in a tight cluster, their faces pale beneath the wig powder. They had not expected to be named so openly. They had assumed their anonymity was protected by the walls of the dissection theater, by the respectability of their profession. May had stripped that protection away with 3 words. Defense counsel objected. Hearsay, the witness cannot know the destination. I followed the cart, May said, trailing it all the way to the gate where she watched them carry it in. Wakley's pen moved again, faster now. He was capturing the collapse of the barrier between the street and the school. For years, the surgeons had claimed ignorance, pleading that they could not distinguish a murdered body from a naturally deceased one. May's testimony suggested otherwise. It suggested knowledge. It suggested complicity. The jury was leaning forward. The baker had both hands on the rail now, knuckles white. They were no longer looking at Bishop as a monster from the slums. They were looking at the surgeons. The real horror was not that a criminal had killed for profit. It was that respectable men had paid for the kill. Bishop shifted again. He whispered to Williams, low and urgent. Williams shook his head, refusing to meet his partner's eye. The alliance was fracturing. The fear of the hangman was heavier than the loyalty of the trade. Wakley could see the calculation in Bishop's posture. He was alone. May had sold him. Williams would follow. The surgeons remained untouchable, protected by their status, but their reputations were bleeding out on the courtroom floor. Did the body bear any marks? The prosecution asked. Yes. Describe them. Blue bruising around the neck, fingers. May made a gesture with his own hand, curling the fingers into a claw, and a cut on the lip from the fall. Consistent with strangulation. And the blow. Wakley stopped. He looked at his notes. The description matched the report he had received from the surgeon at King's College, the one sent anonymously to the Lancet weeks prior. The pieces were locking together. The physical evidence corroborated the witness. The timeline held. There was no room for doubt left in the room. The only variable remaining was the willingness of the jury to condemn men for supplying the medical trade. The prosecution sat down. The defense rose again, but his fire had dimmed. He asked about May's prior convictions, about his debts, about his character. May admitted to all of it. He was a thief, a liar, a survivor, but on the matter of the boy he held firm. He had seen the blow, he had heard the price, he had watched the body go to the school. When May stepped down, he did not look at Bishop. He walked quickly, head down, disappearing through the door behind the witness box, as if fleeing a fire. The door clicked shut. The sound was final. Wakley capped his inkwell, for the testimony was done and the murder established. Now came the harder part, proving that the men who bought the flesh knew it was stolen. He looked towards the cluster of surgeons, who were whispering amongst themselves, passing notes, and avoiding the gaze of the public. They thought themselves safe. They believed their professional standing would shield them from the mud of the Old Bailey. They were wrong. The clerk stood up, clearing his throat for the next name, a surgeon from King's College. The man walked slowly to the stand, adjusting his cuffs, trying to project an air of calm authority that did not reach his eyes. Wakley opened a fresh page in his notebook. The ink was still wet on the last line, glistening black in the gaslight. He pressed the nib down. The real trial was about to begin. The man ascended the steps. He wore black broadcloth, stiff and higher collared, though sweat darkened the linen attessadilla throat. A surgeon, one of the gentlemen who carved the poor for profit while claiming to serve the living. He placed a hand on the Bible, fingers splayed wide, as if to absorb the oath rather than swear it, and murmured the words so low the clerk leaned in to catch them. Wakley watched the thumb rub the edge of the cuff, a nervous tick that betrayed the calm voice he tried to project. "Your name," the prosecution said. "Mr. Partridge. You are a demonstrator at King's College." "I am." "Did you receive a body on the night of the 5th? Partridge shifted his weight. The floorboards creaked beneath his boots, a sharp complaint in the stillness. He looked towards the judge's bench, seeking shelter in the wigs of the court, but found only the cold stare of the law. "We received a subject, yes." "Did you ask whence it came?" "It was not customary to inquire." Wakley's pen scratched across the paper, the sound like a beetle trapped in a box. Not customary. The phrase hung in the air, heavier than the gas smoke. It implied a system, a routine so entrenched that questioning the origin of a dead man was considered bad manners. He glanced at the jury. The baker's jaw tightened. A merchant in the front row shook his head, slow and deliberate. They were shopkeepers. They knew the value of a ledger. They knew that goods without a receipt were stolen goods. "Show the witness Exhibit C," the prosecutor said. A clerk carried the logbook to the stand. It was a small thing bound in cheap calf, its pages stained with fluid and finger grease. Partridge took it. He did not open it. He held it as one might hold a dead rat by the spine, keeping the contents at arm's length. Wakley knew what was inside. He had seen the entries himself when he'd confronted the school weeks prior. The dates, the times, the lack of a certificate. "Turn to the entry for the 6th, the prosecutor commanded. Partridge turned the page. The paper cracked. "Read it." Subject received, male, approximate age 12. Partridge's voice lacked inflection, sounding as though he were reading a grocery list rather than a child's death warrant. "Was there a death certificate?" "No." "Was there a coroner's order?" "No." "Then on what authority did you dissect this boy?" The question landed hard. Partridge looked down at his hands, unable to meet the eyes of the judge. The complicity of the profession was laid bare for the public to see. He was a man of science, yet he stood accused of trading in the flesh of the murdered. The distinction was thinning. We required subjects for instruction. The supply from the workhouses is insufficient. "So you buy from the streets?" "We purchase from agents." "Agents who kill to meet the demand." Partridge did not answer, only staring at the logbook where the ink on the page was dry even as the stain it left on the court remained fresh. Wakley leaned forward, elbows on the rail, for this was the crux. Although the surgeons claimed they were neutral parties, mere consumers of a commodity that existed independently of their demand, the price proved otherwise. 3 guineas for a stiff, 8 for a fresh one. Such a premium invited the knife. "Look at the date," the prosecutor pressed, noting that the boy was seen alive on the 5th. "He was in your theater on the 6th. Do you claim he died of natural causes in 12 hours? "I cannot speak to the cause of death." "But you took the money." "I paid the agreed sum." "To Bishop?" "Yes." Wakley stopped writing, for the link was sealed and the timeline held, leaving no room for doubt in the room. The only variable remaining was the willingness of the jury to condemn men for supplying the medical trade. He capped his inkwell. The metal click sounded like a pistol shot, making Partridge flinch. He knew what the admission meant. He had just signed the warrant for the resurrection men, and in doing so, had indicted himself. The prosecution sat down. The defense did not rise. There was nothing to ask. To question Partridge further was to dredge the mud of the profession higher, to splash the judges themselves with the filth. The court sat in a heavy quiet, the air thick with the heat of bodies and the murmur of speculation. Wakley looked at Bishop. The resurrectionist sat very still. He understood the shift. The surgeons were washing their hands of him. He was alone. The Chief Justice leaned forward. He was an old man, his face mapped with the lines of decades spent weighing guilt against law. He removed his spectacles and wiped the lenses with a silk handkerchief, a slow, deliberate motion that drew every eye in the gallery. When he spoke, his voice was low, yet it carried to the furthest bench without effort. "The law is clear on this matter," he said, explaining that a corpse possesses no property value and therefore cannot be stolen. But a life can be taken, and those who create the market for that life share in the blood. He paused, the silence stretched, taut as a rope. There is no distinction in the eyes of God between killing for money and killing for science. Both extinguish the light, both reduce a soul to meat. Wakley felt the words settle in his chest, a weight that was more than a mere summing up, for it stood as a condemnation of the entire trade. As the judge turned to the jury, he instructed them on the point of murder. He reminded them that the purchase of the body was evidence of the intent to kill, then told them that the lack of a certificate was proof of the illegality of the transfer. Thus, he gave them the path. The jury filed out, and the doors closed behind them, marking the start of the wait. Wakley closed his notebook, the scratch of the pen ceasing as he knew his work was done, and the public record now contained the truth he fought to expose. He looked at the empty witness box. Partridge was gone. While the surgeons had retreated to their college, leaving the accused to face the crowd, the fog outside pressed against the windows, grey and suffocating. Inside, the gas lamps hissed. Bishop whispered to Williams, low and urgent, yet Williams shook his head as the alliance fractured under a fear of the hangman heavier than the loyalty of the trade. Wakley could see the calculation in Bishop's posture. He was alone because May had sold him and the surgeons had abandoned him, leaving nothing remaining but the verdict. The clock on the wall ticked, each second a hammer blow against the shifting, restless crowd that wanted blood and justice and the assurance that their children's grave was safe. Wakley stood up, his legs stiff from the long sitting, and looked towards the dock where Bishop stared at the floor while Williams prayed. As the hours stretched, the door finally opened and the foreman returned. Wakley opened his notebook again. He dipped the pen. He was ready. The ink was still wet on the last line, glistening black in the gaslight. He pressed the nib down. The real trial was over. The judgment was about to begin. Newgate Yard smelled of wet wool gin, and the iron tang of old blood soaked into the cobblestones. Thousands packed the space, a single heaving organism breathing steam into the November air. Wakley stood near the scaffold base, notebook closed in his coat pocket, the leather binding pressing against his ribs like a second heartbeat. He did not need to write this down. The images would burn themselves into his memory without ink. "Make way for the governor." A constable shoved through the thrall, his tricorn hat low over eyes that refused to meet the crowd. People grumbled but parted, the press of bodies shifting like mud sliding down a bank. Wakley held his ground. He had as much right to the view as any magistrate. Above, the wooden platform loomed, damp and grey, the trapdoors distinct against the darker sky. 2 nozzles hung waiting, hemp fibers frayed at the ends. 5 minutes, someone whispered near Wakley's elbow. He turned. A fellow reporter, face pale beneath the brim of his hat, gripped a pencil so tightly the wood threatened to snap. "They say Bishop means to speak," the man said. "Let him," Wakley replied. "Words won't warm him now." The wind picked up, carrying the scent of the Thames, brackish and heavy. It tangled with the smoke from cheap tobacco pipes curling around the legs of the spectators. Boys sat on the rails of the adjoining houses, perched like crows waiting for carrion, their legs dangling over the drop. One kicked his heels against the wood, a rhythmic thudding that stopped only when a woman below swatted his shin. "Stop that," she hissed. "Show respect." The boy shrugged. He wanted to see the jerk. A door opened in the prison wall. The noise of the crowd dipped, a sudden intake of breath across the yard, then surged back louder. Bishop emerged first. He wore a dark coat and trousers, no shackles on his wrists, walking with a deliberate slowness that suggested a man measuring his own remaining steps. Williams followed. The younger man stumbled on the threshold, caught by the turnkey who gripped his arm with a force that whitened the knuckles. They ascended the stairs. The wood creaked under their weight. Wakley watched Bishop's face. There was no terror there, only a grim exhaustion, the look of a laborer who has finished a long shift and wishes only for bed. The chaplain spoke, lips moving rapidly, but the wind stole the words. Bishop nodded. He turned to the crowd. "I hope you all take warning," Bishop said. His voice carried surprisingly clear. "Don't end up here." A shout rose from the back. "Murderer!" Bishop ignored it. He adjusted the cap pulled over his eyes. The hangman, Calcraft, moved behind them, efficient and silent, binding their legs, checking the knots. He pulled the white caps down. Two shapes stood ready. The machinery of the state waited for a signal. "Drop them," the sheriff commanded. The lever clanked. The trapdoors fell away with a crash that echoed off the prison walls. The bodies dropped. The rope snapped taut. Williams jerked violently, his legs kicking at the empty air, boots scuffing against nothing. Bishop fell straighter, heavy and still. The crowd roared, a sound not of joy but of release, a pressure valve bursting after weeks of fear. Hats were thrown. Women wept into handkerchiefs. Men cheered. Wakley stood motionless. He watched the boots. Williams's left boot had a patch on the sole, leather worn thin from walking the streets of St. Giles, hunting the dead. Now it danced for the living. "God save the king," a man beside Wakley shouted. "God save the dead," Wakley muttered. The sheriff raised his hand. The cheering died down, replaced by the restless shuffling of feet. The bodies swung gently in the draft, twisting slowly on the axes of the ropes. 15 minutes, that was the law. Leave them until the soul had departed. Wakley checked his pocket watch. The gold case felt cold in his palm. He thought of the Anatomy Act waiting in Parliament, the clauses being drafted even as the corpses cooled. Legalize the pauper grave, sanction the theft. Bishop and Williams were murderers, yes, but they were also symptoms. Cutting off the head would not cure the disease. "Time," the sheriff said. Calcraft climbed the ladder. He carried a knife. He cut the rope, holding Williams first. The body dropped into the coffin below with a dull thud that sounded like a sack of wet grain hitting the floor. Then Bishop. He fell heavier. The sound vibrated up through the soles of Wakley's shoes. "Is it done?" the reporter beside him asked. "For them," Wakley said, "not for the others." The coffins were loaded onto a cart. The horses stamped, impatient, steam rising from their flanks in the chill air. They were not going to a churchyard. There would be no consecrated earth for these men. The cart wheels groaned as it turned towards the gate, heading for the anatomical theatre at King's College. The circle closed. The hunters became the hunted. The suppliers became the supply. Wakley turned away from the gate. The crowd was dispersing, picking through the mud where the prisoners had stood, looking for souvenirs, a scrap of rope, a stray button. A woman knelt near the scaffold, scraping at the dirt with bare fingers. "What are you doing?" Wakley asked. She looked up. Her face was streaked with soot. "My boy," she said. "They took him last year. Maybe some of this soil belongs to him." Wakley had no answer for that. He pulled his coat tighter. The fog was rolling in now, thick and yellow, swallowing the prison walls, blurring the line between the stone and the sky. It obscured the faces of the men leaving the yard, just as it had obscured the crimes of the men who died there. He walked towards the street. The cart wheels were already fading into the mist, carrying the bodies to the scalpel. "Wait," the reporter called after him. "Will you write it?" Wakley paused. He looked back at the empty scaffold. The trapdoors closed again, hiding the pit beneath. "I will write the truth," he said, "whether they want to read it or not." He stepped out into the street. The mud sucked at his boots. Somewhere in the distance, a church bell tolled, the sound muffled by the damp. The city moved on. The trade would continue. The law was changing. Wakley walked faster. He had an editorial to finish before the printers locked up for the night. The ink needed to be wet before the parliamentarians dried out the supply with their statutes. He touched the notebook in his pocket. It felt heavy. He pushed through the crowd, following the track of the cart wheels into the fog. The cart wheels left a deep, sucking rut in the Strand, a wound in the mud that filled with water the moment the wood passed over. Wakley followed the track. He did not ride. Walking kept the blood moving, staved off the chill that had settled in his marrow since the drop at Newgate. The fog here was different from the prison yard, less sulphurous, more aquatic, clinging to the wool of his coat with a damp, grey insistence. It smelled of river slime and rotting kelp. The breath of the Thames exhaled onto the pavement. Ahead, the lantern on the cart swayed, a single eye blinking through the murk, guiding the horses towards the bridge. King's College waited on the other side, a temple of learning built on a foundation of stolen breath. "Steady," the driver called back, though the horses needed no urging. They knew the route. They had carried many such loads from the gallows to the dissecting room, a regular service more reliable than the mail coaches. Wakley kept pace with the rear wheel. His boots slapped against the wet stones, a rhythmic counterpoint to the creaking axle. He thought of Bishop's face, not as it hung twisted and purple, but as it had been in the dock, smug, certain of the law's limitations. The man had bet on the loophole, the ancient rule that a corpse was no man's property, a thing that could not be stolen. He had lost. The law had found a different lever, a sharper knife. Murder carried the rope, and the rope carried the body to the surgeon. Irony was a poor comfort, but it was the only kind available tonight. They crossed the bridge. The river below was a black void, silent and heavy, carrying the sewage of the city out to sea. No lights reflected on its surface. The fog swallowed the reflection before it could form. On the far bank, the gas lamps of the Strand burned with a sickly yellow halo, illuminating the wet pavement where the cart wheels clattered louder. The sound echoed off the stone facades of the buildings, a hollow rattle that seemed to announce their approach to the empty streets. A watchman stood in a doorway, nursing a cup of something hot, his eyes tracking the procession without curiosity. He had seen this before. Everyone had seen this before or heard the whispers of it. "Turn here," the driver said. The cart lurched into the courtyard of King's College. The gates were already open, held wide by a porter who stepped back into the shadows as the wheels rolled over the threshold. Wakley halted at the entrance. He was not invited inside for the cutting, strictly speaking, but he knew the surgeons. He knew Liston. He knew the hunger that drove them, a hunger not for food but for knowledge, for the map of the human machine. He would find a way in. He always did. The horses were unhooked with brisk efficiency. The coffins, plain pine boxes stained dark with rain, were lifted down by 4 men in aprons. They moved with the practiced ease of porters handling crates of wine, yet there was a tension in their shoulders, a stiffness in their necks. These were not just subjects. These were the men who had supplied them. The suppliers had become the supply. The symmetry was perfect, geometric, cruel. "Take them to the theatre," a voice commanded from the darkness of the corridor. Dr. Liston stepped into the light. He wiped his hands on a towel that was already stiff with dried blood and formaldehyde spirits. His face was flushed, eyes bright with a feverish anticipation that had nothing to do with morality and everything to do with anatomy. He looked at the coffins, then at Wakley standing in the gate. "You followed them," Liston said. "It was not a question." "Someone must witness the end of the line," Wakley replied. His voice sounded thin in the high, tiled hall. "There is no line, Wakley, only a circle." Liston gestured towards the stairs. "Come, the students are gathering. They need to see what happens to those who trade in flesh without license." Wakley climbed the stairs. The wood groaned under his weight, echoing the sound of the scaffold trapdoors. The air grew warmer as he ascended, thick with the scent of lavender water trying and failing to mask the underlying tang of decay. It was a smell that clung to the clothes, to the hair, to the very walls of the building, the smell of the trade. The theatre was a bowl of tiered benches, rising steeply around a central table lit by a cluster of oil lamps. The light fell harshly on the white porcelain of the basin, the gleam of the steel instruments laid out in a row. Scalpels, saws, probes, tools of salvation and desecration in equal measure. The students filled the seats, a sea of young faces pale in the lamplight. They were quiet, unusually quiet. Usually there was chatter, bets on the cause of death, jokes to ward off the nausea. Today, silence hung heavy, a wool blanket smothering the room. They knew whose bodies lay on the table. The news had traveled faster than the cart. Liston took his place at the head of the table. He nodded to the assistants, who lifted the lid of the first coffin. Bishop. The body was stiff, the limbs locked in the rigor of the hangman's dance. The skin was waxy, grey in the lamplight, marked by the purple bruising of the rope around the neck. A dark stain soaked the shirt where the blood had settled. "John Bishop," Liston announced. his voice carried to the back row without effort. Resurrectionist, murderer, subject. He picked up a scalpel. The steel caught the light, a flash of silver against the grey flesh. He did not hesitate. The blade touched the skin just below the sternum. A single, precise incision. The skin parted effortlessly, revealing the yellow fat beneath, then the red muscle, the ribcage waiting to be opened. The students leaned forward. A collective intake of breath rustled through the room like wind through dry leaves. Wakley watched from the gallery above. He gripped the wooden railing until his knuckles turned white. He expected to feel triumph. He had hunted these men, exposed their trade, driven them to the gallows. He should feel victory. Instead, he felt only a profound, hollow sickness. The scalpel moved deeper. The sound of the cutting, the wet tear of tissue, echoed in the silent room. It was the same sound the resurrection men had made in the graveyards of St. Giles, the same sound of violation. Only now it was sanctioned by the state, performed in the light, applauded by the learned. "Note the musculature," Liston said, his voice clinical, detached. "Hardened by labor, the hands show significant callousing." He held up a hand. The fingers were curled, rigid in death. The same hands that had dug up Sarah Goff's child. The same hands that had sold the Italian boy. Now they were specimens, objects of study, stripped of their sin, stripped of their name, reduced to anatomy. Wakley turned away. He could not watch the opening of the chest. He had seen enough blood for one lifetime. He walked to the window. The glass was cold against his forehead. Outside, the fog had thickened, pressing against the pane like a living thing. The city was invisible, erased by the grey wall. Somewhere out there, Sarah Goff was walking home to an empty room. Somewhere, the anatomy act was being drafted, clause by clause, turning the pauper's grave into a legal quarry. Bishop and Williams were dead, but the machine they fed was only just beginning to learn how to run without them. The sound of the saw started behind him, a high, grinding shriek of steel on bone. It vibrated through the floorboards, up through the soles of his shoes into his teeth. Wakley closed his eyes. The circle was closed, yes, but the line continued, stretching forward into a future where the dead belonged to the state and the poor had no sanctuary even in the earth. He pushed away from the window. The editorial waited. The ink had to be wet before the morning. He had to tell them. He had to make them see that the hangman's rope was not the end, but merely the gateway to the next violation. He descended the stairs. The sound of the saw followed him, a rhythmic, grinding pulse that matched the beating of his own heart. He stepped out into the courtyard. The fog swallowed him whole. The cart was gone. The horses were gone. Only the mud remained, churned and dark, holding the imprint of wheels that would never carry Bishop again. Wakley pulled his collar up. He walked towards the gate, towards the street, towards the printing press that would turn his words into weapons. The night was young. The work was not done. The dead were still speaking, and he was the only one listening. The Clay of St. Giles is a work of fiction. Its characters and scenes are invented, but the story is grounded in real events, places, and the social conditions of its period, dramatized, not documented. The history behind it draws on these real sources. Resurrectionists in the United Kingdom. Body snatching. Researched via Wikipedia and contemporary records. Liberties taken with the timeline or with real persons are the author's own.